There are books we inherit, and there are books we hide. Between Genesis and Revelation lies a silence too heavy for mere paper, a silence filled with the scrolls that never made it, banned, buried, burned. The Book of Jubilees is one such silence, a scripture that dared to echo Genesis, but with deeper shadows. A book claiming to be the angelic dictation to Moses atop Sinai. A book that names the watchers, rewrites the covenants, and dares to correct the calendar of God. But if this book was holy, why was it erased? Jubilees does not whisper. It shouts of things the Bible tames, of fallen angels mating with women, of a pre-flood law given to Adam, of exact years and hidden Sabbaths, of prophecy too precise for comfort. It does not accept the timeline of Genesis. It recalibrates it. It does not suggest that the Torah was compiled over centuries. It claims the Torah was dictated all at once, in fire and cloud, by an angel to Moses on Sinai. And suddenly, our theology trembles. Why would a book so loyal to Moses be deemed heretical? Why would the church, and later the rabbinic gatekeepers, silence a text that affirms the law of heaven so boldly, unless that law was never meant to be fully revealed, unless Jubilees peeled back too many veils? The Bible, as we know it, tells us that Enoch walked with God and was no more. Jubilees tells us where he went. The Bible says the sons of God saw the daughters of men. Jubilees gives them names. The Bible says Abraham was tested. Jubilees says by whom. It claims that Jacob was foretold in heaven before he was born, that the 12 tribes were prophesied long before they walked, that angels guarded more than the garden, they guarded the timeline itself. And in this book, time is not ordinary. Time itself is sacred, measured not in human days, but in Jubilees cycles of 49 years, with hidden Sabbaths encoded like divine breath. According to Jubilees, mankind has been living on a distorted calendar. The festivals are off, the years are lost, and the covenant has drifted. Could it be that we do not even know when to worship? Then comes the deeper offense. Jubilees echoes the Book of Enoch, its forbidden brother. Both speak of the watchers, the angels who fell and corrupted the earth with violence and giants. Both claim this corruption was known in heaven and that judgment was foretold. But if that is true, then Genesis is only the surface, and the real war began before Adam ever sinned. Yet Jubilees was not alone in exile. The Gospel of Thomas, the Book of Enoch, the Apocalypse of Abraham, the Ascension of Isaiah, all erased from the canon. And what remained was a skeleton of scripture, a frame without fire. Jubilees dared to offer that fire again. It named the names that Genesis feared. It placed law in the mouth of angels. It suggested that not all sins could be forgiven, some required purging by flood or by fire. This was not comfortable doctrine. This was celestial history. The Quran, centuries later, confirms parts of this forgotten war, the fall of Iblis, the jinn made of smokeless fire, the angels who do not disobey. It tells us of the preserved tablet, of records written before time. It confirms that Abraham was tested, that Moses was spoken to directly, that Enoch, Idris, was raised to a high station. In strange ways, the Quran aligns with Jubilees where the Bible goes silent. What if that is no coincidence? What if Islam preserves what Christianity censored? What if the Book of Jubilees was banned, not because it lied, but because it revealed too much truth? What if it challenged not the prophets, but the priests? And deeper still, what if time itself has been manipulated? If our calendars are wrong, our Sabbaths misplaced, our festivals mistimed, then are we praying on the days heaven never opened? Are we seeking God in rhythms he never blessed? Jubilees claimed that sin is not merely action, it is disorder in time, that to forget the calendar is to sever the covenant. And if that is true, then the greatest deception is not in doctrine, but in chronology, not in theology, but in time itself. So the question returns, quiet but burning. Why did the councils ban this book? Why did scholars redact it, then forget it, then deny it? And why does the Quran confirm the very things Jubilees dared to preserve? What if Jubilees was never meant to vanish? What if its voice was the voice of Sinai, not rejected, but too raw? What if the angel who spoke to Moses is still waiting to finish the dictation? And most of all, what if the book of Jubilees was not forbidden because it was false, but because it was first? In the beginning, time was not measured by men, but by light. Days were not counted by clocks, but by the turning of stars, the rhythm of moons, and the breath of the divine that hovered over the deep. The book of Genesis opens with the poetry of creation, but it leaves the question of calendar in the hands of silence. Yet in the shadows of this silence, another book once whispered a different account, one that dared to define time not as we know it, but as heaven intended. The book of Jubilees, once read, once revered, now buried beneath centuries of theological dust, tells us that time is sacred, not arbitrary, that God did not merely create light and dark, sun and moon, but encoded within them a cosmic rhythm, a jubilee cycle of 49 years, a calendar governed not by man, will but by divine decree. According to Jubilees, Moses did not descend Sinai with 10 commandments alone. He carried with him the very architecture of time itself, dictated not by tradition, but by an angel of the presence. 49 years made a jubilee, and 7 jubilees made a sacred era. Sabbaths were not just days of rest, but checkpoints in a celestial map. Festivals were not inventions of a wandering people, but moments chosen before creation. And if that is true, then what happened to this calendar? Why does the Bible we read today not follow it? Why does Judaism observe a lunar calendar, while Christianity adopted a solar one derived from Rome? What if the real calendar of God was hidden? Worse, what if it was replaced? The book of Jubilees claims that the children of Israel fell away not only in worship, but in chronology, that by abandoning the heavenly calendar, they severed their alignment with divine favor. It warns of a time when festivals would be kept on the wrong days, when sacred weeks would drift into error, and the appointed times of atonement would become hollow rituals, disconnected from the heartbeat of heaven. This is no small accusation. For in the worldview of Jubilees, to keep time wrongly is to worship wrongly. It is not merely a matter of scheduling, it is a question of covenant. If Passover is kept on the wrong day, then is the blood still seen. If the Day of Atonement is shifted, then is mercy still opened. The implications are staggering, and yet the modern Bible makes no mention of this crisis. It hints at feasts and fasts, but says nothing of a calendar war. It records the festivals, but not the warning that they could be forgotten. Jubilees, in contrast, centers its entire revelation on this very danger. It declares that Enoch was shown the calendar of light, that Noah preserved it through the flood, and that Abraham was commanded to restore it. And when Moses stood on Sinai, it was revealed again, a map of appointed times, precise, unchanging, eternal. But over time, men drifted, empires rose, priests compromised, and the calendar was lost. Or was it? The Quran never mentions the Book of Jubilees by name, but it echoes its obsession with divine order. Indeed, the number of months with Allah is 12, it says, in the Book of Allah, the day He created the heavens and the earth. It affirms a divine calendar set at creation, a sacred rhythm that predates Moses, Abraham, even Adam. And in Surah Al-Kahf, the people of the cave sleep for 309 years, a discrepancy between solar and lunar reckoning that scholars still debate. Some say it is a hidden commentary on calendars, a subtle nod to the idea that divine time and human time are not always aligned. And if that is so, then the Islamic view quietly confirms what Jubilees dared to say aloud, that mankind has wandered not just morally, but chronologically, that to be out of sync with heaven is to be adrift in more ways than we know. Jubilees takes this further. It names the festivals that should be kept, the Feast of Weeks, the Day of Remembrance, the Feast of the New Year, and warns that these would be forgotten. It laments that Israel would follow the calendar of the Gentiles, celebrating at times not appointed, dancing on days that were never blessed. And in this, Jubilees becomes more than history, it becomes prophecy. For today, both Jewish and Christian calendars differ wildly, not only from each other, but from the one outlined in this ancient scroll. The Jewish year, based on lunar months, often inserts an entire leap month to realign with the seasons. The Christian year, anchored by Easter, follows the Gregorian system born from Roman decree. with feasts timed by councils, not covenants. If Jubilees is correct, then both systems have drifted from the original path. The Sabbath, the feasts, the sacred year, all misaligned. But who decided to silence this book? Who judged it apocryphal, unworthy of canon, too rigid, too strange, too unorthodox? Was it the church? Was it the rabbis of Jamnia? Or was it something deeper, a fear that if Jubilees were accepted, the authority of later interpretations would collapse? For if time was divinely fixed, then tradition cannot move it. If Moses was given a calendar from the mouth of an angel, then no council, no pope, no rabbi, no emperor has the right to alter it. Jubilees threatens the entire structure of institutional religion. It does not allow for calendar reform. It claims the times are sacred and eternal, and deviation is sin. In this light, Jubilees was not merely banned because of content. It was banned because of consequence. To accept its calendar is to reject Rome. To embrace its feasts is to abandon the synagogue's adjustments. And to obey its rhythm is to accuse the world of worshipping out of sync. But what if that accusation is true? The Dead Sea Scrolls, hidden for 2,000 years, reveal that the Essenes, a Jewish sect likely linked to the authors of Jubilees, kept a solar calendar remarkably similar to the one described in the book. They rejected the temple priests of their day, accusing them of corrupting both sacrifice and time. They believed that only by following the 364-day solar calendar could one align with the heavenly order, and they, like Jubilees, were erased, marginalized, buried in caves. But when their scrolls were uncovered in Qumran, the rhythm of Jubilees returned, like a heartbeat once thought silenced. Why then does Christianity ignore this book? Why does Judaism classify it as fringe? Why are the people of the calendar treated as heretics, while the shifting feasts of Rome are accepted as sacred? The answer may lie not in history, but in control. A fixed calendar leaves no room for manipulation. A divine rhythm cannot be molded to fit political convenience. It forces surrender, and surrender is not profitable. Jubilees demands too much. It asks that we realign not only our days, but our worldview, that we admit we have celebrated the wrong holidays, fasted on the wrong days, and danced when we should have wept. That perhaps the voice of God thundered from Sinai, not only with law, but with time, and we ignored it. Islam, by contrast, builds its practice around time. The 5 daily prayers are set by sun and shadow. Ramadan begins not by consensus, but by crescent. Hajj is locked to the 12th month, no matter the season. The rhythm is not Roman, it is revealed. And though it follows a lunar calendar, its surrender to divine timing echoes the spirit of Jubilees' obedience to a higher clock. It is not the same calendar, but it is the same principle. Time belongs to God, and man must yield. In this way, Islam becomes the inheritor of Jubilees' truth, even without naming it. And that inheritance is not accidental, for if God is unchanging, then so is his order. If he appointed sacred times, then they do not shift with kings or councils. And if a book once preserved those times, then its silence should trouble us. What if our worship is mistimed? What if the heavens open on one day and we knock on another? What if the blessings fall like rain, but we are standing in the wrong field? Jubilees does not simply accuse, it warns that the generations will forget the appointed times, that they will follow the calendar of the nations, that they will think themselves holy while walking in shadows. It is a sobering thought, one that pierces not just doctrine, but devotion. So we must ask, did Moses carry 2 tablets and 1 calendar? Did he descend Sinai with not only law but rhythm? And if so, who took that rhythm from us? Who replaced it with tradition, with conjecture, with consensus? And if Jubilees preserved the original breath of time, then why is it not read? What if the real heresy was not in Jubilees, but in ignoring it? What if the missing calendar of heaven was never truly lost, only denied? And what if it still ticks, waiting for us to realign before time runs out? In the beginning, time was not measured by men, but by light. Days were not counted by clocks, but by the turning of stars, the rhythm of moons, and the breath of the divine that hovered over the deep. The book of Genesis opens with the poetry of creation, but it leaves the question of calendar in the hands of silence. Yet in the shadows of this silence, another book once whispered a different account, one that dared to define time not as we know it, but as heaven intended. The Book of Jubilees, once read, once revered, now buried beneath centuries of theological dust, tells us that time is sacred, not arbitrary, that God did not merely create light and dark, sun and moon, but encoded within them a cosmic rhythm, a jubilee cycle of 49 years, a calendar governed not by man, will but by divine decree. According to Jubilees, Moses did not descend Sinai with 10 commandments alone. He carried with him the very architecture of time itself, dictated not by tradition, but by an angel of the presence. 49 years made a jubilee, and 7 jubilees made a sacred era. Sabbaths were not just days of rest, but checkpoints in a celestial map. Festivals were not inventions of a wandering people, but moments chosen before creation. And if that is true, then what happened to this calendar? Why does the Bible we read today not follow it? Why does Judaism observe a lunar calendar, while Christianity adopted a solar one derived from Rome? What if the real calendar of God was hidden? Worse, what if it was replaced? The Book of Jubilees claims that the children of Israel fell away not only in worship, but in chronology, that by abandoning the heavenly calendar, they severed their alignment with divine favor. It warns of a time when festivals would be kept on the wrong days, when sacred weeks would drift into error, and the appointed times of atonement would become hollow rituals disconnected from the heartbeat of heaven. This is no small accusation, for in the worldview of Jubilees, to keep time wrongly is to worship wrongly. It is not merely a matter of scheduling, it is a question of covenant. If Passover is kept on the wrong day, then is the blood still seen? If the Day of Atonement is shifted, then is mercy still opened? The implications are staggering, and yet the modern Bible makes no mention of this crisis. It hints at feasts and fasts, but says nothing of a calendar war. It records the festivals, but not the warning that they could be forgotten. Jubilees, in contrast, centers its entire revelation on this very danger. It declares that Enoch was shown the calendar of light, that Noah preserved it through the flood, and that Abraham was commanded to restore it. And when Moses stood on Sinai, it was revealed again, a map of appointed times, precise, unchanging, eternal. But over time, men drifted, empires rose, priests compromised, and the calendar was lost. Or was it? The Quran never mentions the Book of Jubilees by name, but it echoes its obsession with divine order. Indeed, the number of months with Allah is 12. It says, in the Book of Allah, the day He created the heavens and the earth. It affirms a divine calendar set at creation, a sacred rhythm that predates Moses, Abraham, even Adam. And in Surah Al-Kahf, the people of the cave sleep for 309 years, a discrepancy between solar and lunar reckoning that scholars still debate. Some say it is a hidden commentary on calendars, a subtle nod to the idea that divine time and human time are not always aligned. And if that is so, then the Islamic view quietly confirms what Jubilees dared to say aloud, that mankind has wandered not just morally, but chronologically, that to be out of sync with heaven is to be adrift in more ways than we know. Jubilees takes this further. It names the festivals that should be kept, the Feast of Weeks, the Day of Remembrance, the Feast of the New Year, and warns that these would be forgotten. It laments that Israel would follow the calendar of the Gentiles, celebrating at times not appointed, dancing on days that were never blessed. And in this, Jubilees becomes more than history. It becomes prophecy. For today, both Jewish and Christian calendars differ wildly, not only from each other, but from the one outlined in this ancient scroll. The Jewish year, based on lunar months, often inserts an entire leap month to realign with the seasons. The Christian year, anchored by Easter, follows the Gregorian system born from Roman decree, with feasts timed by councils, not covenants. If Jubilees is correct, then both systems have drifted from the original path. The Sabbath, the feasts, the sacred year, all misaligned. But who decided to silence this book? Who judged it apocryphal, unworthy of canon, too rigid, too strange, too unorthodox? Was it the church? Was it the rabbis of Jamnia? Or was it something deeper, a fear that if Jubilees were accepted, the authority of later interpretations would collapse? For if time was divinely fixed, then tradition cannot move it. If Moses was given a calendar from the mouth of an angel, then no council, no pope, no rabbi, no emperor has the right to alter it. Jubilees threatens the entire structure of institutional religion. It does not allow for calendar reform. It claims the times are sacred and eternal, and deviation is sin. In this light, Jubilees was not merely banned because of content. It was banned because of consequence. To accept its calendar is to reject Rome. To embrace its feasts is to abandon the synagogue's adjustments. And to obey its rhythm is to accuse the world of worshipping out of sync. But what if that accusation is true? The Dead Sea Scrolls, hidden for 2,000 years, reveal that the Essenes, a Jewish sect likely linked to the authors of Jubilees, kept a solar calendar remarkably similar to the one described in the book. They rejected the temple priests of their day, accusing them of corrupting both sacrifice and time. They believed that only by following the 364-day solar calendar could one align with the heavenly order, and they, like Jubilees, were erased, marginalized, buried in caves. But when their scrolls were uncovered in Qumran, the rhythm of Jubilees returned, like a heartbeat once thought silenced. Why then does Christianity ignore this book? Why does Judaism classify it as fringe? Why are the people of the calendar treated as heretics, while the shifting feasts of Rome are accepted as sacred? The answer may lie not in history, but in control. A fixed calendar leaves no room for manipulation. A divine rhythm cannot be molded to fit political convenience. It forces surrender, and surrender is not profitable. Jubilees demands too much. It asks that we realign not only our days, but our worldview, that we admit we have celebrated the wrong holidays, fasted on the wrong days, and danced when we should have wept. That perhaps the voice of God thundered from Sinai not only with law, but with time, and we ignored it. Islam, by contrast, builds its practice around time. The 5 daily prayers are set by sun and shadow. Ramadan begins not by consensus, but by crescent. Hajj is locked to the 12th month, no matter the season. The rhythm is not Roman, it is revealed. And though it follows a lunar calendar, its surrender to divine timing echoes the spirit of Jubilees, obedience to a higher clock. It is not the same calendar, but it is the same principle. Time belongs to God, and man must yield. In this way, Islam becomes the inheritor of Jubilees' truth, even without naming it. And that inheritance is not accidental, for if God is unchanging, then so is his order. If he appointed sacred times, then they do not shift with kings or councils. And if a book once preserved those times, then its silence should trouble us. What if our worship is mistimed? What if the heavens open on one day and we knock on another? What if the blessings fall like rain, but we are standing in the wrong field? Jubilees does not simply accuse, it warns. That the generations will forget the appointed times, that they will follow the calendar of the nations, that they will think themselves holy while walking in shadows. It is a sobering thought, one that pierces not just doctrine but devotion. So we must ask, did Moses carry 2 tablets and 1 calendar? Did he descend Sinai with not only law but rhythm? And if so, who took that rhythm from us? Who replaced it with tradition, with conjecture, with consensus? And if Jubilees preserved the original breath of time, then why is it not read? What if the real heresy was not in Jubilees, but in ignoring it? What if the missing calendar of heaven was never truly lost, only denied? And what if it still ticks, waiting for us to realign before time runs out? If time is sacred, then altering it is sacrilege. The Book of Jubilees does not hesitate to make this claim, nor does it shy away from its implications. According to its testimony, the very rebellion that began with the fallen angels, the Watchers, extended not only into sin, but into schedule. These Watchers, it says, corrupted humanity not just with violence and lust, but with the distortion of time. They introduced sorcery, they taught astrology, and most dangerously, they disrupted the order of days. Jubilees traces this corruption like a thread through history, from Enoch to Noah to Abraham to Moses, each generation tasked with restoring the divine rhythm, each generation tempted to forsake it. And this view of history, unlike the sanitized timelines of modern theology, insists that the great test of humanity was not only obedience to law, but alignment with God's appointed time. What made the sin of Cain so grave was not merely murder, but that he brought an offering at an incorrect time. What made the flood necessary, Jubilees claims, was that the Nephilim not only polluted the earth with blood, but dislocated it from heaven's clock. This is a theology of alignment, a sacred astronomy, where stars were not to be worshipped, but watched as divine signals, not for omens, but for appointments. And once that rhythm was shattered, even the temple could not restore it. Jubilees insists that only through total return to the solar calendar, the 364-day count beginning on a Wednesday, the day the sun was made, could the covenant be re-established. Yet this very calendar was rejected by later scribes, declared heresy by rabbinic councils, and mocked by Greek philosophers. And so, the people began to mark time not by heaven's decree, but by empire's rhythm. The 7-day cycle was preserved, but the months became unstable. The festivals floated. The covenant frayed, and those who remembered, like the Essenes, like the keepers of Qumran, were driven into caves, their scrolls buried in jars while temples burned and altars cried out on the wrong days. But the Quran, centuries later, would echo the warnings of Jubilees in its own language. It declared that the people had changed the appointed times, that they differed concerning the Sabbath, that the scriptures were distorted not only by word, but by forgetting the measures. Indeed, they changed the words from their places, it says, and those places were not merely doctrinal but temporal. Even in the story of Musa, the Quran emphasizes his retreat to the mountain not once, but twice, 30 nights and then 10 more, 40 in total, mirroring the structure of sacred time found in Jubilees. And when the Quran speaks of sacred months, it aligns them with the heavenly order, not the confusion of later calendars. This is not coincidence. This is continuity. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was not sent to invent new law, but to restore the original pattern. And in doing so, Islam preserved what the Book of Jubilees lamented, a people surrendered to the will of God not only in prayer, but in time. The 5 daily prayers move with the sun. The lunar months, though different from the solar calendar of Jubilees, are still bound to divine observation. Ramadan begins not by decree, but by sighting. Hajj occurs not when kings command, but when the 12th month comes. Friday is not just a social holiday. It is the day of gathering chosen by God. This rhythm, this submission, this surrender to divine timing, this is what Jubilees claimed was lost, and Islam has made living. And so we return to the core claim of that banned scroll, that time is not a neutral backdrop. It is a vessel of obedience. To be a believer is to walk in sync, not only in behavior, but in breath. Each fast, each feast, each act of devotion, it must occur not when convenient, but when commanded. And if those commands were forgotten, if the calendar was altered, then no matter how sincere the worship, it becomes misaligned. Jubilees speaks of this tragedy with grief. It says that in the last days, the people will keep festivals on the wrong days, offer sacrifices on the wrong Sabbaths, and believe they are righteous while walking in error. And then it says, judgment will fall not because they lacked belief, but because they mismeasured their lives. This view is unsettling. It accuses not the rebellious, but the religious. It challenges those who pray with confidence, but never ask whether their days are true. It indicts entire traditions built on beautiful rituals, but timed by the wrong stars. And it explains why the Book of Jubilees had to be silenced. For if it were read aloud, if its calendar were embraced, then the legitimacy of entire religious systems would crack. The Jewish calendar, fixed by lunar cycles and adjusted by human authority, would be exposed as drift. The Christian year, with its Easter determined by councils and its Christmas disconnected from any appointed feast, would be seen as invention. And even modern secularism, which organizes life by Roman weeks and capitalist hours, would be shown as a grand forgetting. Only in Islam does a trace of divine rhythm survive, and even then it requires vigilance. The moon must be watched, the sun must be honored, the shadow must be known. For as Jubilees reminds us, the signs in the heavens were not given for superstition. They were placed for signs and for seasons and for holy days, and to ignore them is to ignore the very structure of revelation. Moses, when given the Torah, was not handed random rules. He was given a sequence, a pattern, a sacred flow of time, and when he descended the mountain, he carried not only commandments but a clock. That clock was the calendar of heaven, and its silence in our present canon is not innocent. It is intentional. For if we remembered the times, we would question the traditions. If we restored the days, we would expose the drift. And if we submitted to that calendar again, we would walk as Abraham walked, as Noah did before the flood, as Enoch before he was taken. And in doing so, we would remember the covenant not only in belief, but in rhythm. And perhaps that is why the book of Jubilees was never destroyed, only hidden, because those who walk in sync with heaven cannot be erased. They can only be buried like seeds, and when the time is right, exactly right, they rise again. The calendar of heaven was not merely a way to measure days, but a thread that wove mankind into the rhythm of the divine. And when that thread was cut, the soul of the covenant frayed, unraveling silently through generations who prayed at the wrong hour, fasted in the wrong month, and gathered on days that God had not sanctified. The book of Jubilees warned that this severing would not feel like rebellion but devotion, that the people would still lift their hands and recite their verses, still honor their ancestors and sacrifice with precision, but none of it would align with the pulse of the heavens. In its vision of sacred history, every patriarch, from Adam to Abraham, from Enoch to Moses, walked according to that original calendar, not as scholars, but as servants tuned to the divine cadence. Yet over time, Jubilees says, the nations intervened, empires interrupted, and scribes who sought to make the law more manageable, more portable, more Roman, recalculated the days. What was once received from an angel on Sinai became subject to human adjustment. What was fixed in creation became flexible by committee. And so the years drifted, not in rebellion, but in subtle compromise. The Sabbath shifted. The festivals moved. The covenant remained on parchment, but vanished from time. And in that drift, a deeper loss took root, not just of chronology, but of clarity. Jubilees speaks of a moment when even the faithful will not know they are misaligned, when entire generations will inherit holy texts, but ignore holy time, believing they are within the will of God while walking in a pattern never appointed. And now, standing thousands of years beyond Sinai, we see that warning fulfilled. Passover and Easter no longer speak to each other. The Sabbath and Sunday pull in different directions. Even within Islam, which preserves much of the divine rhythm, modern neglect and political control have led to disputes over moon sightings and artificial calendars. The sacred has become scheduled by bureaucracy, and the remembrance of God, which once moved with the sky, is now boxed into convenience. But still, the truth echoes. The Quran preserves the principle of divine time, declaring that the number of months is 12, fixed from the day of creation, and that among them are 4 sacred months during which blood is forbidden and peace is commanded. And in this declaration, we see a subtle affirmation of what Jubilees tried to protect, that time is not human territory. It belongs to the one who shaped the stars. Even the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in his final sermon, reminded the Ummah that time had returned to its original form, as it was the day Allah created the heavens and the earth. This was no poetic flourish. It was a restoration. It was a resetting of the clock, corrupted by generations of manipulation. And so the rhythm of Islam, its daily prayers aligned with the sun, its months determined by the moon, its sacred actions tied to divine intervals, becomes not only worship but resistance. It resists the empire's calendar, the colonizer's week, the capitalist clock that turns time into profit and erases the unseen. And yet, even now, the call of Jubilees remains incomplete. For while Islam has preserved much, the specific calendar of the 364-day solar count, beginning on the 4th day, the day the sun, moon, and stars were created, remains absent. Some scholars argue that the Quran's alignment with lunar time supersedes the solar frame of Jubilees. Others say the distinction is not conflict, but complement, one marking ritual time, the other eternal cycles. But the deeper question is not solar or lunar. It is who decides when God speaks. Is it man or is it heaven? And if heaven, then which calendar echoes his voice? If we have lost his rhythm, can we still claim to be dancing in his presence? And if the book of Jubilees preserved that rhythm, then why was it silenced? The answer lies not only in doctrine, but in fear. For if this book is true, if time was fixed, and we have drifted, then every liturgical year celebrated across Christendom is built on sand. Every fast broken by calculation instead of observation becomes misaligned. Every prayer uttered on a wrong day, though sincere, may miss the gate of divine response. And that is a burden too heavy for institutions to bear. Easier to declare the book heresy, easier to bury the scroll, easier to declare that truth changes with counsel and consensus. But what if it does not? What if the heavens still move according to that original rhythm? What if the angels who revealed the calendar to Enoch and Moses still mark the days, still open the gates, still wait for a people who remember the timing? And what if the Ummah, with all its flaws and disputes, remains the last community on earth still connected to divine time, not in perfection, but in posture? What if Sahur and Iftar, Dihua and Maghrib, Hajj and Jummah are echoes of a pattern older than Abraham, older than Eden? Then perhaps Islam has not merely preserved a religion. It has preserved time itself, but that preservation must be awakened, it must become conscious. The Book of Jubilees does not call for ritual, it calls for return, a return to the first rhythm, a return to sacred time, a return to the moments when heaven and earth moved as one. And so we must ask, if our prayer is sincere, but our timing is wrong, will the gates still open? If our feasts are joyful, but our days are misaligned, will the light still descend? And if Jubilees was silenced because it threatened to expose the drift, then who truly banned it, Rome or Revelation? For the Quran says, indeed, we sent it down in a blessed night, a night chosen not by scholars but by decree. What if that decree still pulses through the universe? What if the real sin is not in disobedience, but in worshipping out of sync? What if the final judgment is not only for belief, but for alignment? And so we are left with the closing challenge, soft but piercing. If Islam preserved the law and prayer, but forgot the calendar of Jubilees, has it remembered fully? And if Christianity clings to the name of Jesus, but celebrates resurrection on a Roman feast, has it remembered at all? And if the Book of Jubilees was not a fantasy, but a reminder, what does it mean for all of us still counting our days by the wrong sun? What if we are living by a clock God never set? What if the prayers we offer are beautiful but late? What if the real test of obedience is not in sacrifice, but in schedule? What if salvation was always written in time, and we've been worshipping out of season? And what if the Book of Jubilees was not lost, only ignored? Before there was Genesis as we know it, before the polished verses of In the Beginning, before the canonical rhythms that shaped millennia of theology, there was another telling, older in form, bolder in claim, and exiled from the canon not for its error, but for its accuracy. The Book of Jubilees presents itself not as an alternate version, but as the original, dictated by an angel to Moses atop Sinai, a divine retelling of Genesis that fills the silences modern scripture dares not touch. It stretches back before Eden's gates were sealed, before the serpent hissed his first lie, to a world where angels watched the creation of Adam, recorded his fall, and feared the consequence of his descendants. It does not merely name the patriarchs, it measures their lives with mathematical precision, listing dates, months, and days as if time itself were a character in the story. Jubilees dares to say what Genesis avoids, that Adam and Eve had daughters long before Seth, that Cain married his sister, that the lineages were known and preserved, not guessed or lost. It claims the fall was not only disobedience, but a distortion of sacred time, that the very act of eating from the tree disrupted a rhythm that had been ordained, and that Adam's exile was not only from Eden, but from divine alignment. The Genesis we know offers poetry, but Jubilees offers schematics, a framework of divine chronology, of covenants written before birth, of destinies spoken before conception. And if that version had been canonized, the theology of the world would look nothing like it does today. Jubilees teaches that the law existed before Sinai, that Abraham kept the Sabbath, that Jacob celebrated the Feast of Weeks long before Moses stood trembling with tablets. It insists that the commandments were not given anew, but restored, that humanity had simply forgotten what was once common knowledge among the righteous. This is not a story of origin, it is a story of return. And perhaps that is why it was banned. For if the law was not new, then Moses was not legislator, but reminder. If the patriarchs knew the feasts and kept them, then the central claim of later Judaism, that the covenant was born at Sinai, becomes a misunderstanding. If the calendar of heaven was given to Enoch, then preserved by Noah and guarded by Abraham, then the Mosaic era becomes one of revival, not innovation. The Book of Jubilees presents a world in which the Watchers, fallen angels who defiled the daughters of men, are not vague threats but named, judged, and punished. It names the giants, it names the sons of Noah who fell into sin, and it names the tribes before they existed. This is prophecy embedded in chronology. This is revelation disguised as history, and that is what makes it dangerous to those who wield authority by selective memory. Genesis is safe. It leaves space for interpretation, for commentary, for human mediation. Jubilees is not. It claims to be the angelic version, the heavenly account, and it leaves no room for speculation. It speaks of tablets of heaven, where the deeds of men are written before they occur. It speaks of angels who guide nations, and of demons born from the dead flesh of the Nephilim, roaming the earth until they are bound at the end of days. It speaks of a hidden war beneath the surface of history, one that Genesis hints at but never confirms. The Jubilees version of Genesis is not metaphor, it is map. And if we had been raised on it, the Christian doctrines of original sin, of sudden covenant, of new law would not exist. We would know that Adam fasted in sorrow, that Eve wept for 40 days, that Noah burned incense from the moment the ark landed. We would know that Abraham was taught the law by angels, that he fasted the same days we now call sacred. We would know that Jacob's ladder was not a dream, but a memory of heaven's structure. But that knowledge was hidden, not by accident, but by design. The early councils needed simplicity. They needed a beginning that was vague enough to mold, a Genesis that left space for Pauline theology, a creation that permitted original sin, even if Jubilees says sin was personal, not inherited. For if sin is not inherited, the cross loses its premise. And if the law was always known, grace becomes clarification, not contradiction. The church could not canonize a book that invalidated its foundations. The rabbis could not preserve a text that undermined Sinai. And so the Book of Jubilees was sent into exile, not burned, but buried, not rejected for heresy, but silenced for precision. Yet the Quran, when it appeared centuries later, echoed this older Genesis. It declared that Adam received words of repentance from his Lord, that his sin was forgiven, that he was taught by God directly. It confirmed that Iblis refused to bow not from ignorance, but pride. It confirmed that Abraham was guided before scripture was written. It confirmed that Isaac and Jacob were rightly guided. And it called the Torah a reminder, not a debut. This is Jubilees theology, echoed in the Quran, denied by the canon. And so we must ask, what was lost when we rejected the fuller Genesis? What doctrines were built on absence? What truths were erased to make room for tradition? Jubilees did not contradict Genesis. It expanded it. It answered what Genesis left blank. It provided cause for every effect, intention for every action, divine planning behind every name. And if we had read it, perhaps we would not argue over whether the law was abolished, or whether angels fell, or whether the Nephilim were real. We would know, and perhaps that knowing was too much for a world that preferred theology over truth. So we ask now, if the Quran remembers what the church forgot, and if Jubilees whispered what Genesis left unsaid, then which book tells the whole story? What if our origin was never meant to be a mystery? What if the rejected Genesis was the original all along? The Book of Jubilees does not merely retell Genesis. It redefines it, not by contradicting the known stories, but by illuminating the cracks where silence once lingered and inserting into those voids a sequence so exact, so uncompromising, that theology becomes not a matter of belief, but of chronology. In this alternate Genesis, we are not presented with vague genealogies or symbolic spans of time, but with names, numbers, dates, and a divine calendar whose rhythms are said to echo the breath of creation itself. Jubilees begins not with metaphor, but with mathematics, claiming that the world was shaped in 49 divisions of time, each governed by angels who observe human history from above, inscribing every deed into tablets of light. It says that sin is not abstract rebellion, but deviation from cosmic law, a drift from the appointed times, from the heavenly calendar, from the pattern written before Eden was breathed into being. According to this rejected Genesis, Adam and Eve did not simply fall, they lost alignment. Their exile was not just from a place, but from a rhythm. And their descendants did not inherit their guilt, as later Christian doctrine would insist, but inherited their confusion, a forgetting of sacred time, sacred order, and sacred speech. Jubilees restores speech. It gives words to the silences in Genesis, explaining that Cain's wife was his sister, a wan, born on a known day during a known year. It tells us that Adam kept the Sabbath, that he taught his sons to fast, that his tears for Abel fell not in nameless grief, but on the anniversary of his death, a day that would later be marked by prophets as a day of mourning. It says that Noah knew the calendar of heaven, that he marked the new year and the Sabbaths even in the ark, that the dove returned on the feast of the first fruits, that the rainbow was not just a symbol of peace, but a reminder to keep time as it was in the beginning. Jubilees insists that Abraham did not simply receive the covenant, but renewed a forgotten one, a covenant made with Enoch, with Adam, even with the angels before him, who swore by the throne of God to record all things and preserve justice. It says Abraham built altars not randomly, but on appointed days, that he circumcised Isaac not on the 8th day by instinct, but because the law had already been known. And this version leaves no room for theological invention. If Abraham kept the law before Sinai, then the Torah is not merely a response to Egyptian slavery, but a return to a pattern written at creation. This removes the idea of dispensations. It removes the claim that the law began with Moses and ended with Christ. It removes the pillars of Pauline theology. Because if the law was eternal, then grace is not its replacement, but its mercy. If the Sabbath was known in Eden, then ignoring it is not cultural, it is cosmic defiance. And so the canon had to silence Jubilees. The church needed a Genesis vague enough to allow for reinterpretation, but Jubilees did not allow such space. It named the ages of men, listed the months, described how the stars aligned on key days, and declared that those who alter the calendar were enemies of the covenant. In this way, the book indicts much of religious history. It accuses the scribes of tampering. It says plainly that Israel will go astray not only in worship, but in time. That they will keep the Passover on the wrong day, that they will worship in temples defiled by the timing of foreign kings, and that the only remedy would be a prophet who brings the people back to the rhythm of heaven. The Quran echoes this without naming Jubilees. It says that Abraham was neither Jew nor Christian, but upright, and that he submitted to God long before the scriptures were revealed. It speaks of a mother who was told to fast from speech. It tells of angels recording deeds. It mentions the sacred months, the celestial decree, the book with God in which all things are written. These are Jubilees' ideas clothed in new verses. Islam in its rituals moves with time in a way that the Jubilees calendar would recognize, with fixed prayers by sun, months by moon, feasts by command, and a pilgrimage that is not symbolic, but scheduled. Yet it also leaves space for mercy, for the drift of nations, and the need for a final messenger to realign the crooked paths. And in that alignment, Muhammad becomes the prophet Jubilees predicted, not a new founder, but a restorer of original time. This rejected Genesis does not merely explain history, it defines what was lost. It says that the fallen angels, the Watchers, brought more than corruption. They brought false seasons. They taught the art of misleading time, introducing sorcery not only in action, but in astrology. And when the sons of Noah descended from the ark, Jubilee says they were given strict laws to avoid this corruption, to divide the land, not the weeks, to honor the appointed days, not invent new feasts, to remember the Sabbaths as they were given to Enoch, the first man who walked with God and did not die. But the nations forgot. Egypt altered the calendar to serve its sun gods. Babylon distorted the week into planetary cycles. Rome introduced leap years, and with them leaped past the divine intervals. The people of the book, Jews and Christians alike, bent to the pressure of kings and priests, adjusting the festivals to avoid persecution or to blend with local customs. Sunday replaced the seventh day. Easter floated based on the moon, not the law. Yom Kippur became a tradition upheld by rabbinic calculation, not divine decree. And in all of this, the rhythm was lost. Jubilees foresaw it. It said the generations will sin by keeping the feasts on the wrong days. It said the covenant would be broken by calendars, not just by idolatry. It said the only path back would be through remembering the original Genesis, the one not written by scribes, but spoken by angels. The question now is not whether Jubilees is historical, but whether it is prophetic. If it is true, then the religion of time has been replaced by a religion of convenience. If it is accurate, then our current versions of Genesis, clean, poetic, vague, are only fragments, and the true pattern lies waiting in a book declared apocryphal, exiled by the church, forgotten by most of Judaism, but eerily mirrored by the Quran. What does this mean for those who seek truth? It means the story of the beginning is not finished. It means we must read what was rejected. It means the original covenant may still be valid and waiting to be remembered. The rejected Genesis may not have vanished. It may be whispering even now in the timing of the stars, in the prayers that rise at sunrise, in the fasts kept at moonrise, in the call to worship that divides the day as Jubilees once mapped it. And if that is true, then our return to God is not only a matter of faith, but of calendar. We must ask, what if Genesis was only part 1? What if the second half was never lost, only left unread? If the Genesis we inherited is incomplete, then the faith built upon it is partially blind, and the Book of Jubilees, long buried in caves and dismissed as apocryphal, stands not as a rival to Genesis, but as its missing half, the lost voice of the beginning that dares to name what was left unnamed, to date what was left undated, and to restore the rhythms that Genesis softened for liturgy and law. Jubilees does not float in mystery, but marches in precision, retelling creation not with poetic metaphor, but with detailed schedule, asserting that the fall of Adam was not merely an ethical break, but a cosmic dislocation from sacred time, that Cain's sin was not just violence, but a distortion of sacrificial rhythm, that Noah's obedience was not only moral but chronological, as he kept the feasts and the Sabbaths according to divine intervals passed down from Enoch, and that Abraham's righteousness was not a new discovery, but a remembrance of laws older than Sinai, a return to the original ways that had been taught by angels, etched into heavenly tablets, and abandoned by generations seduced by power and empire. Jubilees makes bold claims. That the law was never new, that all the patriarchs practiced it long before Moses received it, that the festivals were fixed not by councils but by creation itself, and that every deviation from this calendar was recorded as covenantal violation, a forgotten rebellion hidden not in idolatry but in the reshaping of time itself. For when the sacred days were altered, when the Sabbaths were moved, when the feasts were delayed or accelerated to match human needs or royal decrees, the people did not just break a command, they stepped out of alignment with heaven's pulse. And Jubilees insists that this drift led to catastrophe, that even the exile of Israel was not merely for golden calves or neglected orphans, but for a deeper sin, worshipping out of sync. The scroll reveals that the angels charged with watching over nations grieved not only over injustice and corruption, but over calendar confusion. For time, in Jubilees, is not neutral but holy, and every misstep in time is a misstep in worship, and every misaligned festival becomes a sacrifice not unto God, but unto forgetfulness. This framing changes everything, because it means religion itself can become error when time is distorted. It means theology that forgets the divine calendar risks speaking in the right language at the wrong hour, and Jubilees provides a picture of history where the chosen people rise and fall not just by faith or idolatry, but by remembering or forgetting appointed days. And this cosmic view of chronology leaves no room for theologies built on innovation. It accuses the later traditions of Judaism and Christianity alike of hiding the original rhythm, replacing it with new feasts, new fasts, new holidays crafted for empire, for politics, for comfort, and Jubilees becomes dangerous not because it lies, but because it refuses to allow flexibility in what was fixed by heaven. If Abraham kept the Feast of Weeks, if Isaac offered sacrifices at set times, if Jacob followed a known calendar, then Moses did not introduce the law, he merely codified what already was. And if the law predates Sinai, then so does accountability, and if accountability has always been rooted in time, then misaligned religions, even if sincere, are walking sideways through history. And here enters Islam, not as a rival but as a correction. For when the Quran speaks of the sacred months, of the preserved tablet, of Abraham's uprightness, of the angelic record, of divine decree descending on a blessed night, it is not inventing a new religion, but echoing what Jubilees claimed from the start, that the story of man has always been shaped by obedience to fixed appointments, and that submission to God includes submission to his calendar. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did not teach new seasons, but restored the fasts, restored the lunar observations, restored the sacred months, even announcing in his farewell sermon that time had returned to its original form, as it was on the day God created the heavens and the earth, and that restoration fulfills the very lament of Jubilees, a text which warned that time would be broken and must be healed before judgment. And in this way, the Quran becomes a completion of the Genesis that Jubilees preserved and the Bible rejected. Because while the Genesis of the Bible leaves gaps, who did Cain marry? When were the feasts established? How did Noah know which animals were clean? Why does Abraham offer tithes to Melchizedek? The Jubilees account fills them all, providing answers not through speculation but revelation, giving dates, sequences, names, reasons, and placing behind each human decision the guiding hand of heavenly recorders who wrote before time began, and whose records still wait to be read by those willing to see history not as myth but as map. But this map was deemed too detailed, too rigid, too absolute for the fluidity of later theology, and so it was hidden and buried not because it erred, but because it revealed too much, and the councils who chose the canon needed a Genesis that could support their doctrines. Original sin, sudden covenant, new law, dispensations, replacement, mystery ideas which collapse if Jubilees is true, because Jubilees says the law is eternal, the covenant is continuous, and sin is personal, not inherited. This destroys the logic of substitutionary atonement. It challenges the idea that grace had to replace law. It removes the uniqueness of Sinai. It makes Jesus a restorer rather than a sacrifice, and it leaves no room for claims that salvation came only with the cross. Because if Adam was forgiven without blood, if Abraham was justified by command, if Isaac and Jacob lived the law before Exodus, then redemption is older than religion, and mercy does not require martyrdom. It requires memory. Memory of the rhythm that was known before the flood, before Babel, before Pharaoh, before Rome. And if this is true, then the canon we know was curated not for clarity, but for control. Jubilees was banned because it made religion uncontrollable, because a people who walk by God's timing cannot be manipulated by imperial festivals or ecclesiastical councils. And when Islam appeared, it did not canonize Jubilees, but it mirrored its essence, restoring prayer to sun movement, restoring fasting to lunar calculation, restoring pilgrimage to appointed months, preserving the idea that time is a sacred trust, not a human tool. And so the Ummah unknowingly walks in the very rhythm Jubilees long to restore, not as solar ritualists, but as lunar custodians of divine appointment. And in this harmony, the rejected Genesis lives again, not in print, but in prayer, not in councils, but in crescents, not in temples, but in sujud. And so we are left with a question that trembles beneath centuries of scripture. What if the story we call Genesis is only a summary? What if the details we were denied are the very keys to understanding God's plan? What if salvation is not rooted in belief alone, but in remembering what was erased? And if Islam remembers the rhythm that was silenced, if it restores the law that was declared expired, if it echoes the language of the beginning that was never meant to change, then we must ask, what truly defines faith? The book that was canonized, or the rhythm that was preserved? And if the book of Jubilees was banned because it made the truth too plain, then we must ask, boldly and without fear, what if the Quran did not just confirm the prophets? What if it confirmed the forbidden Genesis itself? Before the flood, before the fire of Babel, before the first altar was built from stone, there was a man who did not die but was taken, Enoch, the scribe of heaven, the seventh from Adam, the one whom Jubilees calls righteous not merely for his deeds, but for his knowledge of the hidden. In the book of Jubilees, Enoch is not simply a mystery, he is a threat to those who wish the heavens to remain sealed. He is taught by angels, shown the structure of time, the order of creation, the names of those who sinned in the heights, and he is commanded to write not for his own age, but for the final generation, for the children of corruption who would forget the truths buried in the soil of Genesis. And what he wrote was dangerous, not because it was false, but because it was too precise, too revealing, too unfiltered. He recorded the names of the Watchers, the fallen angels who descended in the days of Jard, who took wives from among the daughters of men and taught them forbidden arts, incantation, sorcery, astrology, the cutting of roots and the smitting of embryos in the womb. These angels, according to Jubilees and the older book of Enoch, defiled creation not only with violence, but with knowledge, twisting what was once holy into weapons of control. Their union with human women bore the Nephilim, giants of destruction, who devoured the labor of men, who drank the blood of beasts and warred across the mountains, and their crimes reached the heavens where the holy ones wept. In Genesis, this episode is hinted at with caution. The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and took wives of all they chose, a single line, pregnant with mystery, but sealed with silence. Jubilees tears that seal wide open. It names Azazel, the chief of the fallen, and recounts how he was bound in a desert until the day of judgment, how his deeds remained among men even after his chains, how his influence persisted through generations of hidden magic and unsanctified knowledge. But the most radical claim is that Enoch was sent not merely to write, but to testify against these angels, that his writings were taken back into heaven, inscribed in the heavenly tablets, and used as evidence in the judgment against the Watchers. This is the war that the canonized Bible refuses to acknowledge, a celestial courtroom in which man testifies against angels, in which prophecy becomes prosecution, and scripture becomes sword. The book of Jubilees affirms that Enoch walked with God, but it also reveals why, because he was chosen to bear the burden of knowledge, to learn the heavenly order, to transcribe the calendar that governed the stars and seasons, and to teach it before it was lost to confusion. It claims that the corruption of the angels introduced not only moral sin, but a calendar of chaos, disrupting the appointed times of worship, injecting false Sabbaths, counterfeit months, and thus severing the link between heaven and earth through temporal deception. And so Enoch's writings were preserved, not among kings or priests, but in caves, in silence, awaiting a generation who would find them again when the world had forgotten the truth of its beginning. The early church fathers knew of these writings. Tertullian defended the book of Enoch, Jude quoted it directly, and Peter referenced its watchers and their chains. But the councils of the 4th century saw that to accept these books was to accept a worldview where angels could fall, where giants once ruled, and where the roots of sin were older than Eden. More dangerously, to accept Enoch and Jubilees was to affirm that some angels were not merely messengers but rebels, that the spiritual world was not orderly but wounded, and that divine justice had already been executed once before the flood, a judgment not of humanity alone, but of celestial beings. This shattered the simplicity of later theology, which required clean hierarchies and manageable doctrines. If angels could fall, if they could lust, if they could bleed and teach sorcery and be punished with torment, then heaven itself had once been in conflict, and that admission was too unstable to support the neat systems of redemption the church was building. And so the book of Enoch was banned, and with it, Jubilees was exiled, because it dared to confirm what Enoch had written, not only the fall of angels, but their influence over time, over nations, over kings, over calendars. The war on Enoch was not just literary, it was theological, spiritual, and political. His writings made no distinction between spiritual rebellion and temporal corruption. They claimed that the Watchers introduced not only sin, but systems of sin. They built the foundations of empire, of hierarchy, of technology without wisdom, of rituals without obedience. Jubilees goes further to say that these fallen ones corrupted even the memory of sacred time, persuading men to worship on the wrong days, to offer blood at the wrong hour, to count months according to the moon when the sun had been ordained as ruler. This was not mythology, it was indictment. And when Islam appeared, it confirmed the existence of jinn, of Iblis, of celestial beings capable of pride and defiance. It declared that Satan was not a metaphor, but a being who refused to bow, who whispered to man as the Watchers once did, and it confirmed that the Quran was protected, not like previous scriptures which had been altered, but sealed against corruption. Yet the themes of Enoch and Jubilees echo within its pages: the preserved tablet, the angelic recorders, the descent of commands, the imprisonment of rebellious spirits, the idea that sin began not only on earth, but in the heavens. The Quran does not name Enoch often. Idris, peace be upon him, is mentioned briefly, but it elevates him, saying he was truthful, patient, raised to a high station. And in that phrase, scholars heard the echo of Jubilees, that Enoch did not die but was taken into heaven, not for escape, but for assignment. He became the intermediary between realms, the prophet who mapped the stars, the one who testified against corruption, the one whose writings were never meant for his own time alone. In that light, Islam becomes the religion that confirms the war, not by quoting Enoch directly, but by restoring its moral structure. Islam teaches that angels do not sin, but the jinn do. It teaches that spiritual beings exist, that rebellion is real, that the unseen world influences the seen, and that man is accountable not only for what he does, but when he does it. This is Jubilees, calendar restored in spirit, if not in format. And this is why the angels had to be silenced, not because their fall was shameful, but because their story disrupted the official narrative. A narrative that taught the fall began with Eve, that sin came from a woman's curiosity, not from celestial violation. A narrative that placed blame on man alone and placed salvation in human blood, not divine justice. But Jubilees would not allow such distortion. It said the angels fell before the flood, that their deeds infected mankind, that their judgment came swiftly, and that their knowledge survived, hidden, darkened, renamed, but alive. And if we trace the roots of ancient knowledge, astrology, alchemy, necromancy, we see the fingerprints of the Watchers. If we trace the mythologies of Greece, Egypt, Sumer, we see distorted echoes of the Nephilim, remembered as titans, demigods, heroes, cursed kings. And yet the canon keeps silent. It mentions giants briefly, then turns the page. It mentions angels, but never their crimes. Jubilees and Enoch name them all. And so we ask, why was that story erased? What threat does it pose to believe that some angels sinned, that their judgment was public, that their deeds still haunt the world? What does it mean if time itself was distorted not by emperors, but by fallen beings whose influence lingers in the very calendars we follow? Jubilees answers, and that answer cost it its place in the canon. For it taught that Enoch recorded not myth, but testimony, that the sin of the Watchers began the unraveling, that only by realigning time, truth, and worship could mankind be reconciled to heaven. And Islam, centuries later, answered with its own final scripture, one that rejected Trinity, denied original sin, restored monotheism, named jinn and angels distinctly, warned of Iblis and his whispers, and taught that prayer, fasting, and pilgrimage must be aligned with divine timing, not inherited traditions. And in that alignment, the war on Enoch is reversed. His voice, long silenced, finds echo in the Adhan. His witness, once sealed, reopens in the rhythm of sujud. He may not be named often, but his path lives, in every record kept by angels, in every breath counted in remembrance, in every fast kept by moonlight, in every nation called to return. And so we must ask, if Jubilees and Enoch were banned for revealing too much, then what did we lose when we silenced their voices? And what do we recover when we begin to listen again? In the ancient records that time tried to bury, Enoch stands not as a figure of legend, but as a man caught between two realms, chosen not for kingship or miracles, but for the burden of knowledge that threatened the authority of both heaven and earth. And the Book of Jubilees ensures that we do not reduce him to a passing name in Genesis who walked with God and was no more, but instead reveals him as the first prophet of calendars, the original witness of angelic rebellion, the scribe whose pen dared to name the crimes of heaven's exiles. His story, as expanded in Jubilees and Enoch, shakes the foundations of comfortable theology, for it tells of angels who were never meant to descend, but chose to cross the boundary of heaven and earth. and in doing so unleashed not only corruption of flesh, but confusion of time, knowledge, law, and sacred order. And this descent was not neutral. It was betrayal, it was insurrection, it was seduction of the seen by the unseen, and the offspring of this betrayal, the Nephilim, were not just giants in size, but giants in destruction, devourers of men, twisted shadows of creation, and their presence filled the earth with cries that reached the very throne of God. Enoch, living in those days, was not merely a man of righteousness, but a man who listened to the whispers of the watchers, to the wails of the oppressed, to the voice of heaven that told him to write what he saw. And in that command to record, to document, to preserve, Enoch became the first man to write scripture, not for the generation of the flood, but for the final generation, for those who would one day rediscover the pattern and realize that history had been edited, that truths had been removed, that sins had been reassigned, and that the war was never only between good and evil on earth, but between rebellion and remembrance across all creation. Jubilees insists that the Watchers did not merely fall. They taught, they manipulated, they mapped the stars not for wonder but for domination. They gave men knowledge without submission, technology without boundaries, enchantment without purity, and thus opened a portal between the sacred and the profane that God never intended to be breached. And Enoch was shown this breach, taken through the heavens to see the layers of creation, the order of judgment, the names of angels both faithful and fallen, and was told to inscribe everything so that no generation could ever claim ignorance again. He did, and his writings were hidden, preserved among the righteous, passed to Noah, to Shem, to Abraham, and yet over time they were suppressed, especially when they began to challenge the growing narratives of priestly power. For if Enoch knew the law before Sinai, if he recorded Sabbaths before the tablets, if he exposed angelic sin before Eve touched the tree, then entire religious systems built on exclusive claims began to tremble, and so Enoch had to be erased, his writings labeled dangerous, his truth reframed as myths. The Book of Jubilees stands as defiance against this erasure, as a document that preserves the memory of the original revelation and dares to accuse not only men but angels, to speak of spiritual hierarchy fractured by pride, and to name the precise moments when creation was infected with arrogance, not human arrogance alone, but celestial, as Azazel and Semjaza, leaders of the Watchers, turned their divine stations into tyranny, becoming the first corrupters of time by introducing false rituals, unclean festivals, days of blood outside the appointed cycles, teaching humanity to break the harmony between creation and creator. Jubilees does not romanticize the fall, it calculates it, assigning years, dates, even warnings of when the Watchers would be judged and bound in darkness. And it centers Enoch as the one who delivered the indictment, whose testimony was taken up by angels to present before God, a court document of sorts against the high crimes of the heavens. And this is the heart of the story that Christian canon could not tolerate, for it not only declared that angels could fall, but that their sin predated human sin, that evil began not with Eve but with pride above, and this deeply challenged the later emphasis on original sin as rooted in man alone. And in response, the councils buried the books, preferring a Genesis that was elegant but vague, one that hinted at celestial activity but left it undefined, comfortable for dogma and doctrine. But the silence was too loud to ignore, and echoes of Enoch survived, in the Epistle of Jude quoting him directly, in 2 Peter referencing the chains of angels, in early church fathers like Tertullian defending the book's authority, and eventually in the dusty caves of Qumran, where copies of Enoch and Jubilees waited like time capsules for a generation, ready to see what had been redacted. And then came Islam, not to revive Enoch's text directly, but to confirm its spirit. The Quran tells of Iblis, the one who refused to bow, the jinn who chose pride and was cast down, and in doing so reintroduces the idea that sin began in the unseen, that the first rebellion was spiritual, and that its echoes are felt in human history through whispering, deception, false knowledge, and temporal drift. The Quran speaks of angels who do not disobey, of spirits who do, of divine command descending in stages, of records kept in guarded tablets, of prophets raised and taken up. And among them, Idris, whom many believe to be Enoch, is described as truthful, patient, and lifted to a high station, which mirrors Jubilees' account precisely. But the war did not end with the fall of the Watchers. Their influence persisted, their knowledge remained among men, and Jubilees warns that in the last days, their systems would return, hidden in plain sight, disguised as progress, ritual, science, law, even religion, but all rooted in the same calendar corruption and false worship that Enoch had denounced. The giants are gone, but their ideologies endure: the glorification of power, the worship of knowledge without surrender, the manipulation of sacred time for political ends, and once again, mankind is asked to remember not just who to worship, but when. For the Watchers, Jubilees says, attack the calendar first, knowing that if man worships on the wrong day, he misses the door entirely, and the angels who kept the gates would not open them outside the appointed hour. And here Islam stands as the final counterattack, by aligning worship to divine time, by restoring prayer to the sun's journey, fasting to the moon's cycle, pilgrimage to the sacred months. It undoes the Watchers' sabotage not with sword but with rhythm, returning mankind to the timetable of heaven through submission. And in that rhythm, Enoch's mission finds its living echo, not in his books being recited, but in his pattern being lived. The war against him was never just literary. It was spiritual warfare between distortion and order, between forgotten truth and restored path, and by aligning worship with God's clock, Islam revives what Enoch preserved, proving that though his name is rarely spoken, his legacy moves in every bow, every fast, every breath that remembers its creator at the appointed hour. And so we are left with a piercing truth. If the fallen angels disrupted time, and Enoch was raised to record the truth, and Jubilees preserved his witness, then silencing those texts was never about heresy. It was about fear that if humanity remembered the beginning, it would no longer bow to priesthoods or empires, but to God alone, at the right time, in the right way, just as Enoch once walked, and was no more, because God took him. The story of Enoch, as told in the book of Jubilees, does not end in silence but in ascent, for unlike Adam who was cast down, or Noah who was spared, or Abraham who was tested, Enoch was taken not because he was perfect, but because he remembered what others forgot, and in remembering he became a mirror of the heavens, a man so aligned with divine rhythm that the separation between flesh and light could no longer contain him. And Jubilees does not treat his departure as myth or mystery, but as commission, saying he was lifted to guard the storehouses of knowledge, to record the deeds of the Watchers, to preserve the calendar of righteousness, and await the day when that knowledge would be needed again by a world wrapped in deception. His writings were never meant to be public while the world was unready, for they burned with the weight of angelic betrayal, with timelines that shattered the illusions of religious authority, and with names too holy and too profane to sit comfortably in the pages of scripture shaped by empire. And so the war on Enoch became a war on memory, a campaign not fought with swords but with censorship, not through denial but through omission, until his scrolls were buried in Qumran and his warnings dismissed as legend. But Jubilees preserved him, not just his name, but his role, his burden, his mission, revealing that he was the first to receive knowledge directly from angels, not as a recipient of favor, but as a scribe of indictment, the man tasked with documenting the sins of the Watchers, with organizing the heavenly tablets that recorded every act of corruption on earth, and with establishing the sacred calendar that those same angels had attempted to corrupt by teaching men the secrets of stars and seasons without the permission of God, thus severing the link between time and truth. This is the core of what was forbidden, the idea that not only can celestial beings fall, but that their fall introduced chaos into the structure of time itself, and that true obedience is not merely moral but temporal, that to be aligned with God is to move according to his appointed rhythm, and that when man loses this alignment, he worships in vain, even if his lips speak praise, because his days are misplaced. And Jubilees presents Enoch as the one who guarded that alignment, who understood that prayer offered on the wrong day is like seed sown in dry ground, that fasting in the wrong month is like mourning without a cause, and that festivals detached from divine instruction are not celebrations of heaven, but echoes of the Watcher's manipulation. For the fallen angels did not only teach lust and violence, they taught how to shift time, how to bend the sacred days to human will, how to overlay ritual with rebellion and disguise it as devotion. The Church, in canonizing a Bible without Enoch, without Jubilees, without the full record of the Watcher's crimes, erased not only a prophet but a pattern. For by removing the cosmic backdrop of the flood, of the giants, of the war in heaven, they reduced sin to a human failing and replaced divine justice with inherited guilt, reframing the cross as compensation for original sin instead of part of a broader restoration of heaven's order. And in doing so, they severed the theology of salvation from the celestial context that Enoch and Jubilees so carefully preserved, a context that Islam, centuries later, would begin to restore, not by quoting Enoch, but by reflecting his revelations through Quranic clarity, the angels who obey without question, the jinn who rebel, the promise that each soul is recorded by unseen scribes, the guarded tablet in which all is written, and the assertion that God does not change the condition of a people until they change what is within themselves, which echoes Enoch's plea to his generation. Return to the calendar, return to the law, return to the covenant etched before the foundation of the world. And in this, Islam aligns not only with theology but with chronology, reviving the central claim of Enoch and Jubilees, that worship is not only about sincerity, but about sequence, and that salvation is not just about belief, but about obedience to time as God defines it. And so the 5 daily prayers move with the sun, not the clock. The fast of Ramadan follows the moon, not the harvest. The Hajj follows lunar cycles, not papal decree. And this structure of worship becomes the echo of the structure Enoch preserved, now lived by a global ummah, many of whom have never read the Book of Jubilees, yet walk its rhythm through revelation, unfiltered by counsel. And so we return to the heart of the war. It was not about denying angels, but denying their fallibility, not about removing Enoch, but removing the memory of heaven's rupture. Because a faith that admits celestial rebellion must also admit that human systems can be corrupted by the unseen, and that not every ritual is righteous, and not every sacred day is appointed by God. And that perhaps even those who claim authority over calendars may be echoing the voices of those ancient watchers who long ago taught men how to rearrange time for their own ends. And this is why the silencing of Enoch was necessary, because his testimony would not allow for replacement feasts, for altered Sabbaths, for rituals built on royal decree instead of divine instruction. And so his scrolls were hidden, his voice quieted, and his story reduced to a footnote. Until the Quran reintroduced a world where the unseen is real, where angels are present, where records are kept, and where the day of judgment is not metaphor but appointment. And Islam, in declaring that every soul will be shown its record, confirms the very reason Enoch was taken, because he was the first to read that record, the first to write it, the first to cry out against celestial corruption, and the first to be lifted so he would not see death in a world that had lost its way. Yet his message remains, whispered in the rotation of the sun, in the crescent of the moon, in the rhythm of prostration, in the breath of dhikr, not quoted but lived, not canonized but practiced. And this is the final irony of the war. That while Enoch's books were banned, his map survived, passed not through seminaries but through submission, not through parchment but through practice. And today, when a believer rises before dawn to pray, or fasts without complaint when the moon is sighted, or gives charity in secret, or recites the names of God in silence, that believer walks the path Enoch once traced in ink and light, the path the watchers tried to block, the path Jubilees refused to forget. So we ask now, not just as historians or theologians, but as seekers, if the angels fell and man was chosen to bear witness, and Enoch was lifted to ensure the record was preserved, then what does it mean that his words were removed from our books but still resonate in our worship? What does it mean that the Quran, without naming him often, fulfills his vision? What does it say about the religions that denied the fall of angels, that ignored the giants, that erased the war in heaven, and replaced divine timing with human counsels? What if the greatest crime of the Watchers was not what they taught, but how they altered time? What if the greatest victory of Enoch was not his ascent, but his warning? And what if Islam, in its rhythm, its law, its surrender, is not only a return to Abraham, but a fulfillment of Enoch, not just in creed, but in clock? So then, we must ask with full weight, if the Quran preserved what the Church refused to canonize, and if the Ummah lives the rhythm Enoch once recorded, then who truly silenced the angels, and who still walks with the one who heard them fall? There was a time when the Bible had a twin, not a contradiction but a companion, not a heresy but a harmony, a book that walked beside Genesis with greater detail, that echoed Exodus with deeper memory, that matched Leviticus law for law, but spoke with a voice older than priesthood, older than council, older even than Sinai's trembling stones. And this book was the Book of Jubilees, once known as the Little Genesis. A divine retelling of the beginning as dictated to Moses by an angel of the presence upon the mountain, claiming to be not just commentary but correction, not merely reflection but revelation, the unredacted record of what the canon later edited or omitted, and its crime was not error but clarity, for it laid bare what the Bible only whispered, named what Genesis veiled, timed what Exodus blurred, and dared to declare that the commandments given to Israel were not new but eternal. That the law was written in the tablets of heaven before Adam ever drew breath, and that the festivals kept by Abraham, the Sabbaths honored by Noah, the fasts observed by Jacob, were not ancestral innovations, but covenantal obligations traced back to creation itself. Yet for this, it was silenced. Jubilees did not claim to replace the Bible, but to complete it, to reveal the divine chronology behind sacred history, assigning days, months, and years to every event, inscribing order where other scriptures offered only sequence, and in doing so, it asserted that time itself was holy, and that the corruption of mankind lay not only in disobedience, but in forgetting the appointed times, in celebrating on the wrong day, in resting on the wrong Sabbath, in offering on a calendar not shaped by God, but by empire. And so the Book of Jubilees became dangerous, not because it introduced new theology, but because it exposed the drift in old theology, showing how the true rhythms of worship had been lost through exile, through compromise, through political expedience, and how even the temple, rebuilt and revered, was no longer aligned with the heavens because its priests had forgotten the calendar entrusted to Enoch, passed to Noah, safeguarded by Shem, and revived by Abraham. All before Moses received it once again on the mountain, not as innovation but as restoration. Yet this story could not survive in a canon governed by Rome, by councils, by creeds that needed simplicity, needed discontinuity, needed a clean break between the old and the new to justify doctrines of replacement and grace without law. And so the twin was left behind, buried in caves, labeled apocryphal. Its verses quoted only in passing by early church fathers who still remembered its authority, until even their voices were overwritten by the momentum of orthodoxy that found such detail too restrictive, too Judaic, too threatening to the sweeping narrative that would center Christendom on the cross and silence any scripture that challenged the notion that the law was a burden, that time had no structure, that salvation was spontaneous. Yet Jubilees remained, and when rediscovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, it spoke again with the same voice, unflinching, orderly, holy, insisting that the world was not made in chaos, but in cadence, that even the angels marked the Sabbaths in heaven, and that man was created to reflect that rhythm, not to define it. And in this light, the Book of Jubilees does not merely add to the Bible. It confronts it, not as an enemy, but as a brother asking, "Why did you forget?" And that question echoes across millennia, for if Abraham kept the Feast of Weeks, if Isaac tithed at divinely appointed times, if Jacob honored the Day of Atonement before Sinai, then the idea that Moses introduced the law collapses, and with it, every theology that relies on the law's novelty, and this is the true threat of the twin. It erases the gap between promise and fulfillment, between patriarch and prophet, between Israel and church. And in doing so, it dissolves the foundations of supersessionism, of dispensationalism, of any doctrine that suggests that God changed his rhythm because his people changed their clothes. And yet, despite this, Jubilees offers no rebellion, only remembrance, no revolt, only return, calling the reader back to what was once known. A world where days mattered, where time was a temple, where sin was not just disobedience but disalignment. And where the covenant was not written on scrolls but on stars, measured in weeks of years and cycles of 49, where the Jubilee itself, the 50th year of release, was not a policy but a prophecy, not an economic measure but a metaphysical reset, a return to Eden's order. And by claiming this, the Book of Jubilees renders all theology that ignores time as shallow, all religion divorced from divine calendar as imitation, and all worship untethered to appointed days as echo without voice. And so when the Bible went west, when it was translated, dissected, canonized, reprinted, preached, politicized, and ultimately weaponized, Jubilees remained hidden, not because it failed the test of truth, but because it passed it too well, because it could not be bent to fit the new theology that needed Christ to begin something new instead of fulfill something eternal. A theology that needed Jesus to override the law rather than walk it perfectly, that needed Sunday to replace Sabbath, and Easter to float while Passover stood still. And in this new system, a twin like Jubilees was intolerable, not for its content but for its constancy, its refusal to forget. And this is why it was exiled not by fire but by forgetting, until the Quran appeared, not quoting Jubilees, but confirming its spirit, affirming that Abraham was not the first to worship, but the one who purified it, that Moses was not the origin of law but its reiteration, that time is sacred, that months are numbered, that deeds are recorded, and that there exists a preserved tablet on which everything is written, including the appointed days of worship that man must observe to remain aligned with heaven. And in this structure, Islam unknowingly fulfills the path laid out in Jubilees, restoring sacred rhythm not by name, but by practice, not by resurrecting the text, but by resurrecting its truth. And so 5 daily prayers return time to the hands of the divine. Ramadan reorients the year around purification. Hajj revives the calendar of Abraham, and Jummah reclaims Friday not as convenience but as command. And though Muslims have never needed the Book of Jubilees to pray, their obedience breathes its memory back to life, walking the cadence of a covenant that predates law and outlasts scripture, a covenant of rhythm, of divine appointment, of sacred days etched before the sun was made. And in this, the Bible's lost twin lives again, not in canon, but in the call to prayer, not in verse, but in veiled memory, not in the church's rhythm, but in the Ummah's surrender. And so we ask, what if the Book of Jubilees was not forgotten, but rejected because it remembered too much? What if the Bible's twin was banned not for error, but for refusing to evolve? What if God never changed, and the only thing that did was time, twisted by the hands of men who needed their calendar to match their creed? The Book of Jubilees begins not with mystery but with precision, not with poetic silence, but with a divine voice dictating to Moses a history already written in heaven. And in doing so, it claims authority not as a retelling, but as the original version, a chronology from the mouth of an angel, structured in weeks and jubilees, revealing that sacred history was never a vague flow of myth and memory, but a tightly measured unfolding of divine will, where every year was marked. Every fast was appointed, every covenant was time-stamped and tied not only to obedience, but to sequence, for in the theology of Jubilees, to disobey is one sin, but to disobey on the wrong day is a deeper violation, a betrayal not only of command but of rhythm. And this idea, more than any doctrinal controversy, is what made Jubilees intolerable to the institutions that rose centuries later, because it dared to say that time was not man's to modify, that worship was not fluid, rituals were not negotiable, and that the calendar itself was part of revelation, not a human tool but a heavenly trust. And this sacred calendar, 364 days long, solar, divided into exact weeks with unshifting Sabbaths and fixed feasts, stood in direct contradiction to the lunar calculations that emerged in Second Temple Judaism and the Roman adjustments that would later shape Christianity. And thus the Bible's twin was seen not as friend, but as threat. Its existence, a constant reminder that the canon had not been chosen by God, but curated by men, trimmed and shaped to serve the agendas of those who needed discontinuity to justify their innovations. Jubilees tells us that the covenant began not with Moses, but with Adam, not with a stone tablet, but with the heavenly tablets guarded by angels, where every law, every holy day, and every act of righteousness was written before the world was formed. And it insists that Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all knew this law, that they offered sacrifices not in confusion, but in accordance with divine appointment, that they honored feasts which were not cultural but cosmic, and that the giving of the Torah at Sinai was not a new contract, but the reissuance of a forgotten one. And this view dismantles the idea that grace replaced law, or that Jesus came to introduce a softer path, because if the patriarchs already lived by grace through the law, then the dichotomy collapses, and what remains is not a contrast, but a continuity that both the Church and Rabbinic Judaism found difficult to defend. The Church, having founded itself on the claim that Jesus initiated a new covenant which freed believers from the burden of the old, could not tolerate a book that said the old covenant had always been a gift, always preceded Moses, and was never a burden but a blessing when understood correctly. And so Jubilees was excluded from the canon, not because it lacked inspiration, but because it made too clear that the commandments were not temporary, that they were known and kept long before Sinai, and that even in the womb, some children, like Jacob, were chosen to guard the holy times. Jubilees is so exact that it names the day Adam was created, the day he sinned, the day he left Eden, and the day he was reconciled, not metaphorically, but numerically, and in doing so it leaves no space for speculative theology. It leaves no space for seasonal feast changes or floating holy days, because it declares that every righteous soul who ever pleased God did so by walking in sync with a calendar given not to a nation, but to creation itself. And yet it also warns, again and again, that this calendar would be lost, that the generations after Noah would begin to forget, that Babel's tower would be built not only to reach the heavens, but to control time, and that the great sin of empires would be not merely idolatry, but the reprogramming of sacred rhythm, using lunar cycles, pagan festivals, and imperial decrees to shift the days until the true Sabbath was unknown, and worship occurred in sincerity, but in misalignment. And Jubilees calls this a hidden sin, one that provokes God's anger not because of rebellion, but because of forgetfulness masked as tradition. And so when the Church shifted the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday, when it adopted Easter by council vote rather than by covenant memory, when it allowed Constantine's empire to fix holy days according to Roman calendars, it fulfilled the prophecy of Jubilees without realizing it, proving the book right even while banishing it from sacred status. And the same drift occurred in Judaism, where lunar calendars were introduced, and feasts adjusted to the phases of the moon rather than the structure of the sun as ordained in Jubilees, which said the sun was created on the fourth day not only to rule the day, but to mark the years, the weeks, and the seasons of divine worship. The Essenes understood this, and they kept Jubilees as scripture. They built their communities around its calendar. They rejected the temple priests as corrupt because they had forsaken the appointed times, and they withdrew into the wilderness to preserve the true rhythm of heaven, awaiting a time when the knowledge would be needed again. And that time came, not through their own survival, but through a religion that had never heard of Jubilees, yet practiced its truth through revelation that came from the same Lord of the heavens and the earth. For when Islam appeared, it came not quoting the Book of Jubilees, but living its structure, restoring prayer to the movement of the sun, restoring fasting to a fixed month, restoring pilgrimage to a sacred lunar alignment, and rejecting the idea that sacred days could be determined by councils, kings, or scholars who strayed from the original rhythm. The Quran speaks of sacred months, of a record preserved before the world began, of angels who document human deeds, of a law given not once but echoed through generations. And in this, it restores the theological framework that the Book of Jubilees tried to preserve, a worldview where revelation is not innovation but restoration, where worship is not spontaneous but synchronized, and where God does not change the law for convenience, but calls mankind to remember what they were always meant to follow. And in this framework, the fact that Islam does not canonize Jubilees is irrelevant, because it fulfills its core truth, it walks its appointed rhythm, and it guards the concept that salvation is not an emotional decision, but a return to divine alignment. And this explains why the Bible's twin could not be accepted by Christianity or post-temple Judaism, because both had built their identities around a newness that Jubilees did not allow. One in which either law was obsolete or timing was optional, and neither view could coexist with a book that claimed the opposite, that the law was eternal and time was non-negotiable. And so Jubilees was buried, the twin was hidden, but the rhythm returned in the rising of the minarets, in the moon of Ramadan, in the day of Arafah, in the prostrations aligned to the sun's shadow, in the Friday gathering that echoes the appointed convocations described in the book's early chapters. And though few Muslims have ever read Jubilees, their lives testify to its memory, their practices confirm its vision, and their worship, structured not by whim but by decree, proves that what was silenced in canon was reawakened in surrender. And so we ask, with honest heart, what if the Bible did have a twin? What if its voice was not lost, but transformed? What if the canon we know was shaped by fear of continuity, and the religion we were told was new is in fact the oldest path, remembered not through councils, but through obedience? What if Islam, in its rhythm, is the echo of a scroll the world tried to forget, and the living proof that the divine calendar was never erased, only reborn? If the Bible had a twin, then the story we call Scripture was always meant to be double-eyed, one scroll for law and the other for light, one to tell us what happened and the other to show us how and when, one for the nations and the other for the remnant who would remember what time truly is. And if that twin was the Book of Jubilees, then we are not dealing with a mere alternate version of Genesis, Exodus, or Leviticus, but with the divine original that stood before priesthoods politicized the word, before kingdoms made holy days serve emperors, before popes took what was fixed and declared it floating, before canon was closed by votes instead of vision. And Jubilees comes not as a supplement, but as a mirror that exposes not just gaps in the story but fractures in the foundation, revealing that the sacred was always structured, that holiness was not just about intention but synchronization, that sin was not only moral but temporal, a drifting from the appointed times, a dancing to rhythms not written in heaven but devised by men seeking to control what they could not comprehend. And in this single, continuous book, we are told that Moses received not only commandments, but a cosmic calendar, a solar pattern that never changed, a structure where Sabbaths were anchored immovably in weeks, where festivals were unshifted by new moons or political necessities, where the entire history of creation was mapped across Jubilees, 49-year cycles that reflected the age of the earth in a language of release, return, and realignment. And this structure was passed not just to Israel, but to Adam, to Enoch, to Noah, to Abraham, and finally to Moses. And when Jubilees says that angels taught this to him on the mountain, it is not giving him new revelation, but handing back what was lost, and by placing this instruction in the mouths of angels, it elevates the calendar of God above the interpretations of rabbis and the decrees of bishops, making it clear that sacred time is not subject to rabbinic midrash or ecclesiastical vote. It is written into the stars, into the seasons, into the story of the world itself. And if we had honored this, then the Sabbath would still fall where it was born, the Passover would not be tied to Easter's whims, and the feasts of the Lord would not be scattered by councils who forgot the sky in favor of the state. But we did not honor it, and so the twin was silenced and time was conquered, turned into property instead of prophecy. And yet the Book of Jubilees did not vanish. It hid, waiting for a people who would walk its rhythm without even knowing its name, and that people became the Ummah of Islam, who though never taught Jubilees, fulfilled its essence with startling precision. For Islam did not just revive monotheism, it revived sacred time, it restored prayer to the sun's journey, fasting to the moon's appearance, pilgrimage to appointed months, and with each act, it rebuilt what had been broken by forgetfulness and forged by empires. And though the Quran does not quote Jubilees, it confirms its deepest truths. That Abraham was upright long before the Torah was inscribed, that the prophets were sent in continuity, not contradiction, that law is not a burden but a mercy, that the days are numbered by God, and that he has never left his creation without guidance. And so in this light, Islam is not a new religion but a restoration, not an invention but a return. And while Christianity builds its claim on fulfillment and Judaism on preservation, only Islam aligns its ritual life with the same cosmic template that Jubilees described, not because Muslims discovered it through archaeology or scholarship, but because the same Lord who gave Moses the angel's voice on Sinai gave Muhammad, peace be upon him, a revelation that beat with the same rhythm. And this is where the story converges. When Muslims fast in Ramadan, when they gather on Fridays, when they stand in rows 5 times a day facing the Qibla, when they await the crescent with their eyes instead of charts, they are stepping into a timeline written before time began, a script older than parchment. And though Jubilees never made it into their book, its song is in their movements. And this raises the most dangerous question of all: what if Islam, unknowing, became the living fulfillment of a scroll that Christianity rejected and Judaism forgot? What if the rhythms of the Quran were always embedded in the structure of the lost twin, waiting to be lived again by those who did not seek power but surrender? And if this is true, then the banishment of Jubilees was never about content but consequence, because to accept it would mean unraveling Easter, undoing Sunday, restoring a Sabbath no longer Romanized, and re-examining the idea that law ever ceased. It would mean the cross is not the end of sacrifice, but a symbol misunderstood outside its calendar context, that Jesus may have fulfilled the law but not by abolishing it. And in this, Islam's insistence that Jesus did not die on the cross becomes more than doctrine. It becomes a defense of the original rhythm, an assertion that the plan of God was never interrupted, never rewritten, only continued through submission, and that the real loss was not the death of a prophet, but the distortion of time. And so the twin still speaks, not from pulpits or power, but from caves, from manuscripts, from the hearts of those who feel the dissonance in modern religion and long for the original song. And Islam, though scorned as late or foreign, may be the echo of that song, the unbroken melody of obedience that began with Adam and flows through the hands of every prophet who bowed at dawn and broke bread on days marked by heaven, not empire. So we ask now, at the close of this section and the edge of something holy, what if the Bible's lost twin was never truly lost? What if it is not a text to be canonized, but a structure to be lived? What if God never chose between books, but between hearts willing to follow the calendar he wrote into the stars? And if Islam walks that calendar, even while the world walks in circles, then what does that say about who truly remembers the days of God? What if the Bible's twin was banned because it revealed that time was never ours to change? What if the final judgment is not only about what we believed, but when we believed it, and whether our feet moved with the rhythm of heaven or the rhythm of Rome? The story of Abraham has always been told with reverence, a tale of faith so strong that he was willing to sacrifice his son, a moment so sacred that 3 religions claim its legacy. And yet, what if the true test of Abraham was never fully written in Genesis, never fully explained in the Torah, but preserved in the forgotten pages of a book the world buried, the book of Jubilees, which tells us not only what Abraham did, but when and why and how often, revealing a man who did not merely obey in a moment of crisis, but lived every day within the architecture of divine rhythm, whose test was not a single act of obedience, but a lifelong struggle to remember a calendar the world had forgotten. And in this version, Abraham is not just a patriarch of belief, but a restorer of time, chosen not because he was the first to believe, but because he was the first to realign. The first to rebuild the altar of appointed days after generations had drifted into chaos and confusion. And when the book of Jubilees speaks of his test, it does not begin at the mountain. It begins in Babylon, in the House of Idols, where Abraham questioned not only the gods, but the days on which they were worshipped, refusing to follow festivals declared by Nimrod's priests, rejecting feasts set by lunar sorcery, and returning instead to the calendar taught to Enoch, preserved by Noah, and whispered to him through divine inspiration before he ever heard a voice in Canaan. In this account, Abraham's journey is not a geographic migration, but a chronological one, a movement back into alignment with a sacred structure of time, and every act of obedience, the building of altars, the separation from Lot, the circumcision of his household, is dated, measured, explained in relation to a heavenly timetable. And when Jubilees describes his near sacrifice, it places it on the appointed day of atonement, transforming the test from a spontaneous trial into a prophetic enactment, a moment of cosmic synchronization where Abraham's willingness to give up his son mirrors the divine willingness to offer mercy, not through death, but through substitution. And this version eliminates the theological infrastructure of inherited sin and penal substitution, because if God never asked for Isaac's blood, but only for Abraham's surrender, and if that surrender occurred on a day already known to heaven, then the meaning of sacrifice changes from punishment to purification, from wrath to return, and what Genesis conceals by omission, Jubilees reveals with precision, claiming that Abraham's test was not only about what he loved most, but about whether he would align that love to divine timing, whether he would rise early not just in obedience, but in accordance with the calendar of appointed offerings. And if that is true, then his righteousness was not an isolated virtue, but a recovered memory, a rediscovery of a rhythm Adam once walked and Cain once violated. And in this telling, Abraham's faith becomes a restoration of divine order after centuries of drift, and his test becomes the reactivation of a covenant written long before Sinai, one that required not only faith, but fidelity to time, to season, to feast. And this detail is precisely why Jubilees could not remain in the canon, because it redefines the meaning of covenant. It transforms Abraham from a man chosen for belief into a man chosen for remembrance, and it removes the novelty of Sinai, the uniqueness of Mosaic law, and instead suggests that the Torah was a repetition, not a new thing, and that the prophets were sent not to introduce new faith, but to return mankind to the faith of Abraham, which was never merely a set of beliefs, but a structured obedience to a divine calendar. And this undermines the very foundations of later theology, which required Abraham to be a precursor, not a restorer, which required law to be new and grace to be sudden, and which built its entire understanding of sacrifice upon the assumption that God demanded blood, when in fact, according to Jubilees, God demanded remembrance. And so Abraham is tested not by being asked to kill, but by being asked to trust the appointed time, to raise the knife and then receive the substitute, to walk the path and then stop on command, to obey the schedule and surrender the outcome. And in this, the true test is not the sacrifice, but the surrender to rhythm, the willingness to submit to a structure written in heaven before man was formed from dust. And it is this structure that Jubilees maps in full, marking every act of Abraham not with vague narrative, but with specific days and cycles, aligning his life with the calendar of the heavens, and by doing so, it makes him not only the father of monotheism, but the father of divine time. And it is this idea that sacred time is eternal, and Abraham restored it, that made the Book of Jubilees so dangerous to the councils of the early church. For it undermines their claim that Jesus came to end the law, because if Abraham was righteous under law that existed before Moses, and if that law was built into the stars, then law is not abolished by grace, it is fulfilled by remembrance. And Islam affirms this completely, not by quoting Jubilees, but by embodying its revelation. For when Muslims say that Abraham built the Kaaba and called mankind to pilgrimage, when they gather on the plains of Arafat on the 9th day of Dhul Hijjah, when they slaughter their animals on Eid al-Adha to honor his obedience, when they pray in lines facing the Qibla he once established, they are walking his path, not as myth but as memory, not as metaphor but as time-sensitive worship. And this confirms what Jubilees has always said, that Abraham's test was not a symbol, but a signal, that his obedience marked a return to sacred time, and that those who follow his path must not only imitate his faith, but mirror his calendar. And though the Quran does not canonize Jubilees, it restores its message by mapping sacred acts onto sacred time, fasting in Ramadan, praying at sunrise, standing on specific nights, traveling to Mecca in specific months. Calling back to the schedule Abraham once followed, and in this, the Ummah becomes not the successor of Judaism or Christianity, but the restorer of Abraham's original mission, the fulfillment of a covenant not of law alone, but of aligned obedience. And this is the heart of the forbidden story, that Abraham's real test was not a dramatic moment, but a lifetime of remembering what others forgot, and that Islam is not a new religion, but the final rhythm of the old one. The last movement of a symphony first heard in Ur, played in Hebron, tested on a mountain, and perfected in the valleys of Mecca. So we ask now, if Abraham's real test was time, and if Jubilees preserved that timeline, then who truly follows his way, those who believe without structure, or those who structure their belief to the times he walked? What if the knife was never meant to fall, because the test was never about blood, but about breath held at the right moment, about surrender when the hour was exact, about trusting that God is never late, only we are. To understand the full depth of Abraham's test, as revealed in the Book of Jubilees, is to realize that the narrative we have been taught, the simple image of a father raising a blade above his son, is only the final act of a much older play, one written long before Mount Moriah, rehearsed through years of alignment, and preserved not in symbols but in schedules. And Jubilees does not begin this story with a divine command from the sky, but with a quiet, steady transformation of a man who learned to measure his life not by emotion or impulse, but by divine appointment. For Abraham, in the pages of this forgotten book, does not stumble into greatness by a single act of faith, but earns his title as friend of God by walking a life so synchronized with the calendar of heaven that every offering, every journey, every word of praise is placed not in general obedience, but in exact obedience, and that difference changes everything. Because it reframes the test of sacrifice not as a spontaneous demonstration of devotion, but as the climax of a life lived in rhythm. And this rhythm is what Genesis conceals by brevity, but Jubilees reveals by structure, detailing the feast days Abraham kept, the fasts he remembered, the altars he built on days already sanctified, the law he lived by before Moses ever stood barefoot on Sinai. And this is not a contradiction, but a correction. Not an argument against Genesis, but a fuller rendering of what it never had the space or permission to explain. And when the moment came that Abraham was told to sacrifice his son, it was not a break in the pattern, it was the fulfillment of it. For Jubilees says this occurred during the appointed season of atonement, that the trial was not random, but rehearsed in divine time, that the command to offer Isaac was given not merely to test Abraham's heart, but to reveal whether his trust extended to the appointed hour. And in this framework, the trial becomes prophetic theater, a living parable played out on a day that heaven had already declared sacred, a day reserved for repentance, for substitution, for divine mercy, not divine wrath. And in this version, Abraham's lifting of the knife is not a shadow of the crucifixion, but a contradiction to it, a rejection of the idea that blood is necessary for redemption. For as Jubilees explains, the angel called out not to test further but to stop him, because God does not delight in human sacrifice, and never did. What he sought was alignment, the surrender of will in the exact moment it was requested, and this alone transforms the theology built upon Genesis. For if Abraham's sacrifice was meant to end in substitution, then the later claims that God offered his own son to satisfy justice become theologically unanchored. And the idea of divine wrath demanding blood is not supported but undermined. And here, once again, the Book of Jubilees becomes a threat, not because it denies the sacred, but because it defines it too clearly, refusing to allow mystery where God has given appointment. And in doing so, it reclaims the calendar as the center of the covenant, the rhythm that binds man and creator. And this calendar was not lunar, nor was it open to interpretation, but fixed, solar. 364 days, with Sabbaths that never shifted, feasts that never floated, and sacrifices that were not assigned by priestly consensus, but by heavenly command. And Abraham's greatness was not in innovation, but in restoration, for he re-established this structure after generations had forsaken it, teaching his household to walk by it, offering burnt offerings and peace offerings in their seasons, setting up altars in places where his descendants would later receive commandments. And this claim that the patriarchs lived under law before the law is perhaps the most devastating challenge to both Christian and Jewish theology, for it renders Sinai as a renewal, not a beginning. And if Abraham already kept the law, then it is not unique to Israel nor abrogated by the New Testament. And this is precisely why the Church could not accept Jubilees, for it dissolves the argument that the law was temporary, that grace replaced regulation, and that Jesus came to fulfill something that was meant to pass away. Because if law is eternal, if even Abraham sacrificed on appointed days, then the path of salvation was never about abolition but realignment, never about discontinuity but return. And in this light, Abraham becomes the first model of Islam, not the religion that took his name centuries later, but the surrender that defined his life, the submission not only to command but to calendar, not only to trial but to time. And the Quran confirms this without hesitation, declaring that Abraham was neither Jew nor Christian but upright, and that he was guided before the scripture was sent. And this confirms what Jubilees has always insisted, that the covenant is older than Moses, that the law is older than tablets, and that the rhythm of divine time has always been written not in ink, but in light, in the sun and the moon, in the days and weeks that Jubilees maps with such detail that it becomes more than history. It becomes schedule, and Abraham becomes more than patriarch. He becomes prototype, the first to submit without proof, the first to align without explanation. And when Muslims gather every year on Eid al-Adha, offering sacrifice not in sorrow but in remembrance, they are not inventing ritual but continuing it, stepping into the exact pattern that Jubilees described, a pattern that Christianity reinterpreted and Judaism narrowed, but Islam preserved, not because it quoted Jubilees, but because the same God who gave Abraham the test gave Muhammad the rhythm to live it. And so in prayer, in fasting, in pilgrimage, the Ummah revives the test, not by lifting a knife, but by lowering their egos, by standing at dawn, by breaking fast at sunset, by walking between Safa and Marwa as Hajar once did, by offering animals not for forgiveness, but in memory of obedience. And this obedience, this surrender to appointed time, is what made Abraham beloved. And what makes the Ummah his true heirs, not by race, but by rhythm, not by lineage, but by alignment. And this is why the Book of Jubilees had to be silenced, for it proves that obedience without schedule is incomplete, that worship without appointed days is out of sync, and that the story of Abraham cannot be rightly told without the calendar that gave his obedience context and meaning. And so the real question is not whether he was tested, but how and when. And whether we who claim to follow him are following his footsteps or only his fame, his name without his discipline, his story without his structure. And Jubilees answers that question with piercing clarity. Abraham kept the law, he kept the times, he kept the feasts, and he kept the rhythm. And his test was not to kill, but to pause, to trust, to obey, to realign. And if Islam today preserves that pause, that trust, that alignment, then it may be the only community left walking in the exact cadence that God once taught to the father of nations. So we must ask, if Abraham's test was to move at God's pace, then are we being tested too, not by sacrifice but by schedule, not by pain but by precision? And if Jubilees was banned because it revealed the timing of holiness, then what does it mean that Islam, without it, still remembers the rhythm? What if God never asked for blood, only that it be offered on time? The sacrifice that never happened is the one most remembered, and in that remembering, generations have clung to the image of a man and a knife and a sun beneath the sky, as if that single scene defines faith itself. Yet the Book of Jubilees insists that the real weight of Abraham's test was not in the moment, but in the rhythm that led to it, not in the blade raised, but in the calendar obeyed. And that distinction is everything, for it shifts the meaning of faith from heroic gesture to steady surrender, from one act of obedience to a lifetime of divine timing. And when Jubilees tells us that Abraham kept the feasts long before Moses was born, that he honored Sabbaths without ever seeing Sinai, that he tithed and fasted and sacrificed according to cycles not created by tribes, but revealed by heaven. It is reminding us that righteousness was never reactive. It was rehearsed, a pattern built into the life of a man who did not ask for a covenant, but aligned himself with it until it was written into his bones. And in this framework, the event on Mount Moriah is not a theological turning point, but the culmination of decades of synchronized obedience. And Jubilees insists that the test occurred on the exact Day of Atonement, a date not created after the Exodus, but honored before it, a fixed day on which Abraham was instructed to bring his son to the mountain, not to kill him in violence, but to offer him in submission. To see if his love was structured, his trust complete, his timing exact, and what stopped the blade was not emotion but the schedule of mercy that God had written long before. For Abraham's willingness was proven not by sacrifice, but by punctuality, and the ram provided was not plan B, but always the appointed substitution, because the lesson was never about blood, it was about breath held until command, about trust carried through to the final second. And in this light, the entire theology of substitutionary atonement is shaken. For if God stopped Abraham because he never required Isaac's blood, then how can we claim he later required his own son's blood to satisfy a justice he once suspended? And in that contradiction, the Book of Jubilees becomes not just inconvenient, but unbearable to doctrines that rely on the idea of wrath quenched by death. For it tells us clearly that God never delighted in human sacrifice, that the angel was sent not to witness obedience, but to prevent cruelty, and that the offering of animals was always a reminder, not a replacement, a teaching tool for rhythm, not a payment for guilt. And so when Abraham stepped down from that mountain, it was not with trauma but with timing, not with sorrow but with awe, knowing that he had passed not because he almost killed, but because he moved in perfect harmony with heaven's clock, and that harmony is what Islam now mirrors. Not by quoting Jubilees, but by living the exact pattern it describes. For when Muslims gather in the 10th of Dhul Hijjah to offer the Eid sacrifice, they do so not in sorrow, but in synchronized joy, in remembrance not of blood spilled, but of mercy revealed. And their Hajj, their prayers, their fasts all revolve around the same structured Jubilees laid out, solar sacred cycles interwoven with lunar precision, creating a life where worship is not reaction, but rotation. And this proves that the forgotten book lives not in pages but in people, not in creeds but in calendars. And while the church buried Jubilees to protect a theology of rupture, and the synagogue shelved it to defend the primacy of Sinai, the Ummah unknowingly carried it forward, not through scholarship, but through submission, their very rituals performing the music of a book they never read. And in that performance, Abraham's real test lives on, not in story but in steps, not in legend but in law. A law not of oppression, but of order, not of burden, but of beauty. A law that says holiness is found not in sudden leaps of faith, but in daily alignment, in rising before dawn, in waiting for the new moon, in counting the days until the standing at Arafat, in holding back hunger not because of self-denial, but because the appointed hour has not yet arrived. And this lifestyle, this divine choreography, is the legacy of Abraham as seen through the eyes of Jubilees, and it raises the question: if a man's greatness is found in his ability to walk with God's clock, then who truly walks with Abraham today? Is it those who believe but drift, who worship but ignore the schedule, who sacrifice without season? Or is it those who structure their days as he once did, whose surrender is timed, whose obedience is paced, whose trust is expressed not in bursts but in balance? And if so, then Islam is not a foreign faith, but the inheritance of Abraham's timekeeping, the guardianship of a rhythm that began with creation and was nearly lost, not through rebellion, but through forgetfulness, through calendars changed by kings, through feasts reshaped by councils, through Sabbaths moved for convenience. Until the memory of appointed times became myth, and the meaning of faith was reduced to belief without discipline, gesture without grounding, love without law, and it was Jubilees that stood alone in the shadows, crying out that the structure still mattered, that time was still holy, that Abraham's offering was only accepted because it was on time, and that every act of faith without that synchronization is a candle flickering off beat. And so when Islam rose, not to quote the book, but to fulfill it, to restore prayer to solar rhythm, fasting to lunar rhythm, sacrifice to fixed days, standing in prayer when the sun declines, bowing when it rises, circling the Kaaba in the season Abraham once walked. Then the memory of that test, the real one, returned to earth, and the blade that never fell continues to remind the world that obedience is not a moment, but a movement, not a feeling, but a form, not a sacrifice, but a schedule. And this is the challenge Jubilees lays before every faith. Do you follow Abraham's story, or do you follow his structure? Do you honor his name or his calendar? Do you claim his covenant, or do you carry it? And if the answer lies in rhythm, then who among the nations still moves to the beat of the patriarch? Who still kneels when the sun commands? Who still fasts when the moon signals? Who still offers sacrifice at the exact time of mercy, not in bloodshed, but in obedience? And if the church silenced Jubilees because it made Abraham's faith too precise, and the synagogue shelved it because it spread the law too wide, then we must ask boldly, what if the Ummah, in its prostration and its pilgrimage, unknowingly became the keeper of Abraham's real test? What if the ones who never canonized the book now live it, breath by breath, day by sacred day? And what if the final question is not what you believe, but when you obey? The story of Ishmael is told quickly, quietly, almost apologetically, as if his very presence in sacred history is an inconvenience, a shadow cast by the brilliance of Isaac. And in Genesis he is born, he laughs, he is cast out, and he disappears into the wilderness with his mother, his name remembered only when genealogies require it. But the Book of Jubilees does not allow such an easy dismissal. For it opens the scrolls of time and reintroduces Ishmael not as an exile, but as an heir to a divine promise, not as the mistake of Abraham, but as the firstborn who was blessed and counted and given land and legacy. And it forces us to reconsider everything we have been told about the sons of the patriarch, not through imagination, but through heavenly record, claiming that Ishmael was loved, was guided, and was present for longer than the canon admits. And if that is true, then we must ask why his memory was edited, why the rhythm of his life was erased, and why the Book of Jubilees, which preserves his story, was hidden alongside him, buried in caves while the councils told a cleaner story, a simpler one where promise followed bloodline without conflict, where the covenant passed smoothly from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob without pause. But Jubilees insists that such a version is incomplete, that Abraham wept when Hagar and Ishmael departed, that the angel did not merely comfort Hagar, but promised her son a future with God's favor, that Ishmael remained near his father for years afterward, that Abraham visited him, taught him, gave him gifts, and even instructed him in righteousness, and that he too was circumcised, that he too honored the God of Abraham in the way he was taught. And suddenly the idea that he was cast away as irrelevant collapses. For how can a child circumcised into the covenant be considered outside it? And how can a son blessed by an angel be dismissed by theologians who needed a cleaner lineage to support their doctrines? And if Jubilees is correct, then the removal of Ishmael from sacred narrative is not a matter of divine decree, but human editing, a theological surgery meant to preserve the exclusivity of one line over another. And this becomes more than a family dispute. It becomes a spiritual injustice, a rewriting of memory, a severing of Abraham's house that Jubilees refuses to accept. And it tells us that Ishmael was not just present but prophetic, that his descendants were not merely wanderers but nations, that his hand was not always against every man but was used to build, to preserve, to multiply, and that the 12 princes who came from him were not threats but participants in the divine plan. And this makes the Quranic narrative, which places Ishmael at the center of the rebuilding of the Kaaba, not a contradiction but a correction, a restoration of a memory that was once shared and then suppressed. And so the question is not whether Ishmael was important, but why his importance was hidden, and Jubilees may hold the answer, for it was banned at the same time Ishmael was forgotten, rejected by the church, and marginalized by rabbinic Judaism, both of which needed to emphasize the uniqueness of Isaac's line to support their separate claims, one that law must lead to grace, other that Torah alone preserves covenant. But both of these frameworks depended on a narrowing of the patriarchal story, a narrowing that required Ishmael to fade, and Jubilees resisted this by preserving not only his name, but his timeline, his presence, his proximity to Abraham, and his shared inheritance, not the spiritual covenant of Jacob, but a divine role still honored. And Islam affirms this with clarity, stating not only that Ishmael was a prophet, but that his legacy was active. That the Kaaba was raised by his hands and Abraham's together, and that it was he, not Isaac, who remained in the land of Baca. And in this version the exile becomes settlement, the wilderness becomes sacred ground, and the rejected son becomes the root of a nation who would carry the rhythm of Abraham's obedience when others forgot it. And the Quran never attacks Isaac. In fact, it honors him as righteous, but it restores balance by reviving Ishmael's story. By placing him not outside the covenant, but within a separate stream of it, a stream long buried by theological preference and narrative trimming. And that revival mirrors the mission of Jubilees, which does not seek to choose one son over another, but to map the timeline of both, to show that God's favor does not require exclusion, and that Abraham, as a father, blessed both of his sons and taught them the ways of God. And this image of a father walking between two tents, of sons both guided, both called, both purposeful, is one the canon rejected because it complicated the idea of a single chosen nation, a single messianic lineage. But the complexity was always part of the truth, and Jubilees dares to hold it, recording dates and journeys, interactions and instructions, all of which are erased from the Genesis text that moves quickly from Ishmael's exile to Isaac's ascendancy. And so the loss of Ishmael from the mainstream canon was not accidental, it was systemic. A deliberate simplification of a family tree that once had many branches, and in the process, the theology of chosenness became a theology of exclusion, where one son's rise required the other's erasure, and where covenant became competition. But Jubilees shows us something different, a covenant that moves in harmony, where one son carries the seed and the other carries the strength, where one preserves the land and the other prepares the way for a nation yet unborn. And this reading finds new life in Islam, which identifies Ishmael not as secondary but as foundational, not as rejected but as rewarded. And when pilgrims walk around the Kaaba today, when they run between the hills of Safa and Marwa, they are remembering Hagar and her son, not in sorrow, but in exaltation, and that memory, made living in ritual, contradicts the silence of Genesis and the dismissal of doctrine, and affirms what Jubilees tried to preserve. That Ishmael was never outside the divine plan, that he was taught righteousness, that he remained near Abraham longer than the canon allows, and that his story matters not as opposition, but as parallel purpose. And so we must ask now, what was lost when Ishmael was removed from the center of sacred memory? What kind of faith requires the removal of a son to make its story work? And if the Quran revived what Jubilees recorded, and if Islam honors what Christianity forgot and Judaism marginalized, then who truly remembers the full house of Abraham? What if the vanishing of Ishmael was not divine silence, but human strategy? What if the Book of Jubilees was banned because it kept asking the one question no empire wanted to answer? What if God chose both sons? To erase a man from history is to erase his purpose, and to erase his purpose is to deny the generations that follow him the right to know where they came from. And in the case of Ishmael, what was erased was not just a name or a face, but a covenantal rhythm, a legacy of divine alignment that stretched through the wilderness like a river buried beneath sand. And the Book of Jubilees does not let that river dry, for it restores Ishmael not only as Abraham's firstborn, but as a participant in sacred time. Marking his birth, his circumcision, his departure, and his reunion with such care that the act of remembering becomes its own rebellion against the silence imposed by later scribes. And when we read that Ishmael was circumcised at 13, not as a punishment, but as a sign of full understanding, as a young man entering the covenant by conscious obedience, we are faced with a portrayal of spiritual maturity that challenges the idea that he was a mistake to be set aside. And Jubilees confirms this maturity by showing that Abraham continued to love him, visit him, and instruct him in the ways of righteousness, not as a father bound by duty, but as a prophet ensuring that the covenant reached both of his sons. And if this is true, then the casting out of Hagar and Ishmael was never the end, but a movement of divine dispersion, a relocation, not a rejection, and the wilderness they were sent to was not a punishment, but a placement. A site where prophecy would take root, where the boy once left under a bush would become the father of 12 nations. And if the Bible rushes past this with a few verses, Jubilees lingers, because it knows that what is rushed becomes forgotten, and what is forgotten becomes denied. And so it insists that Ishmael lived near Abraham even after the initial departure, that their relationship was not severed but maintained, and that Hagar herself was guided by angels and honored for her endurance, her courage, and her faith, qualities that the Quran later enshrines by placing her movements at the heart of pilgrimage. And so when millions reenact her desperate run between Safa and Marwa, they are not just reliving her survival, they are honoring a woman chosen to carry the prophet whose name became the root of a nation. And that nation, Islam, does not need Jubilees to confirm its truth, but the parallels are undeniable. And in those parallels, we see a thread of memory that was severed by one tradition and preserved by another, and the severing was not accidental, for to include Ishmael in full would have required a theology that allowed for dual legacy, for multiple streams of blessing, for a covenant that did not narrow into a single bloodline, but expanded like branches from a shared trunk. And that is what Jubilees threatens, the exclusivity of covenant theology. The idea that God chooses one and rejects the rest, that his favor cannot coexist with multiplicity, but Jubilees tells us otherwise, showing Abraham blessing both sons, sending gifts not as bribes but as acknowledgement of inheritance, and teaching both Isaac and Ishmael the divine festivals, the rhythm of sacred days, the offerings appointed for the weeks of years and the sabbatical cycles, and this means that Ishmael did not leave empty, he left with knowledge, with memory, with access to the divine schedule, and that changes everything, for it implies that the knowledge of appointed times, of the divine calendar, rejected by those who later followed Babylonian and Roman influence, survived not only in the scrolls of Qumran, but in the descendants of a boy who once wept beneath a desert tree, and who rose to become a patriarch in his own right. And this is why the Quran gives him honor, not as compensation, but as continuation. Recognizing that prophecy did not end with one line, that the knowledge of divine alignment was preserved through the house of Ishmael, and that when the final prophet was sent, it was from his seed, not because his blood was holier, but because his line had preserved the submission of Abraham, the surrender not of name, but of calendar, of prayer, of sacrifice, of appointed days that aligned with the memory kept not in books, but in practice, in tents and valleys and desert skis. And so Jubilees and the Quran together tell a story the canon does not, a story where Ishmael was part of the plan, where his exile was a relocation for preservation, where his descendants became the bearers of sacred rhythm while others drifted into legalism and ritual divorced from divine schedule. And this explains why both books, Jubilees and the Quran, emphasize the importance of time, of days, of festivals, of obedience not just in action, but in appointment. And when Islam prays at sunrise, fasts at moonrise, gathers for Hajj in the sacred month, it is echoing a pattern that Jubilees once mapped with mathematical clarity. And if that pattern was taught to Ishmael, then it is not surprising that his descendants kept it, not through text but through tradition, preserved orally, lived rhythmically, and revived through revelation centuries later. And this continuity challenges the foundations of any faith that sees the Abrahamic story as linear rather than layered, that sees covenant as elimination rather than expansion, that sees Ishmael as rejected rather than redirected. And so we must confront the silence, the intentional vanishing that shaped theology, the trimming of a family tree until only one branch remained, when in truth the whole tree was holy, and Jubilees knew it and wrote it, and was buried because of it, and Islam, without knowing the text, lived it, remembered the unremembered, honored the dishonored, and in doing so, exposed the edit. The erasure, the uncomfortable truth that Abraham had two sons, and God did not choose only one, and if that truth had remained in the canon, then entire doctrines would have unraveled, doctrines built on the exclusivity of election, on the primacy of Isaac to the exclusion of Ishmael. But if both were taught righteousness, if both knew the law, if both were guided, then salvation is no longer a narrow path owned by a people, but a wide way walked by all who remember, all who submit. And in this understanding, Islam is not innovation but restoration, not break but bridge, not new religion but the rhythmic memory of a legacy once silenced by ink and restored by obedience. And we are left with this final question. If Ishmael was erased and Jubilees with him, then who chose to forget and why? And if the Quran raised what the canon buried, then what does it mean that those who were once erased now stand at the center of sacred rhythm? What if Ishmael never vanished, but was simply waiting for the world to remember his place? There is something holy in remembering the forgotten, something divine in breathing life back into a name the world buried. And in the case of Ishmael, that act of remembrance is not just historical, it is prophetic, because to remember him is to challenge the version of the story that was shaped to make someone else more central, more sacred, more chosen. And the Book of Jubilees does not accept such narrative editing, for it presents Ishmael not as a mistake or a misstep, but as a deliberate life. A purposeful son whose journey into the wilderness was not exile but divine redirection, and who despite the pain of departure remained a son under the care and memory of Abraham, visited by his father, blessed by angels, raised with knowledge of the covenant, and entrusted with a legacy that was never annulled. And that legacy was not merely genealogical, it was calendrical, a life built around divine rhythm, a life that observed the appointed times, the fixed Sabbaths. The solar structure of worship that Jubilees says was handed down from Adam to Enoch to Noah to Shem to Abraham, and then to both of his sons, which means Ishmael walked not only with his feet, but with his time in alignment with heaven, and that walking was not disrupted by his journey into the desert, but was continued there, preserved in simplicity, away from the empires and councils that would later rewrite the record. And if this version is true, then the traditional casting of Ishmael as the wild man outside the promise is not divine decree, but doctrinal damage control, a way to preserve the illusion that one son had all and the other had nothing. But Jubilees shows otherwise, showing Abraham preparing both of his sons for legacy, giving each what was due, not only materially but spiritually, instructing Ishmael before his departure, even ensuring he knew the calendar of feasts and sacred years. And this education matters, because it means that Ishmael's descendants did not just multiply, they remembered, and they carried with them a fragment of the original covenant that was never fully lost. And this changes the lens through which we read history, because now the story of Ishmael is not about what was lacking, but what was preserved in silence, what was handed down through tents instead of temples, through memory instead of manuscript, until it was revived not by scholars, but by revelation. When the Quran confirmed what Jubilees had once recorded, that Ishmael was a prophet, that he was righteous, that he helped raise the foundations of the sacred house, and that his mother's legacy would be eternally honored in the rituals of pilgrimage, and suddenly the boy who wept under a bush becomes the man whose story millions reenact each year, not in grief but in submission, not in exile but in alignment, and in this, we see why his memory had to be buried. Because his return would challenge every theology that required a narrow covenant, every doctrine built on the removal of alternatives, every system that depended on forgetting the full house of Abraham. But Jubilees refused to forget, and so it was cast out too, declared uncanonical not because it erred, but because it remembered too well, and in remembering, it reopened the question of what covenant means, and who belongs within it, and if covenant was tied to calendar, to obedience, to remembrance of appointed times, then anyone who kept those rhythms stood within its blessing. And this is what makes Islam so theologically disruptive, because it restores Ishmael without apology, not as a footnote, but as a foundation, not by editing Genesis, but by recentering the story around both sons, and not only their blood, but their practice, their prayer, their shared surrender. And this restoration is not abstract, it is lived. It is embodied in rituals that trace their origin not to Sinai or Rome, but to Baca, to the dry valley where Ishmael lived, and where Abraham returned again and again, not as a stranger, but as a father. And it is in this valley that the Kaaba was raised, not by Isaac's hands, but by Ishmael's, and it is here that generations would gather, responding to Abraham's call, fulfilling a prayer he once made beneath a desert sky, asking that his descendants be made into a nation of those who submit. And that submission became Islam, and that nation became the Ummah, and so we arrive at a truth long buried. That the story of Ishmael was never about rejection, it was about preservation, a different path within the same plan, a parallel stream flowing from the same source, and if that stream was hidden by one tradition and rediscovered by another, then it is not heresy to follow it. It is faithfulness to remember it, and the Quran's honoring of Ishmael becomes not innovation, but inheritance, not invention, but vindication. Affirming what Jubilees was prevented from teaching by councils who could not tolerate two legitimate sons, two sacred lineages, two centers of covenant, and so they chose one and erased the other. And in doing so, they not only silenced Ishmael, they silenced the rhythm he carried, the practices he preserved, the calendar he learned, and the house he helped build. But silence does not last forever, and the rise of Islam broke that silence, and the echo of Jubilees, buried for centuries, was heard again in the footsteps of pilgrims, in the prostrations of prayer, in the sighting of the moon, in the naming of prophets. Abraham, Ishmael, and their legacy reborn in a people who never canonized the book, but kept its beat, and so the erasure failed, and the memory returned, and we are left with the question no tradition can avoid. If Ishmael was taught righteousness, then who gave permission to forget him? If Abraham loved both sons, who declared one unloved? If Jubilees preserved his name, who had the authority to blot it out? And if Islam restored what the canon erased, then what does that say about which faith truly remembers? What if the story of Ishmael is not a shadow of Isaac's, but a light of its own? There is a reason why some books are buried instead of burned, hidden instead of debated, because their danger lies not in what they deny, but in what they clarify, and the Book of Jubilees is one of those books, feared not for being false, but for being too precise, too detailed, too anchored in a structure that exposes the timelines of other scriptures as drifting, layered, and often theologically massaged to fit doctrines rather than chronology. And this is why Jubilees was silenced. Because it presented a timeline that could not be reconciled with the sacred stories as later edited, and that timeline was not speculative but solar, built on 364 days, on fixed Sabbaths, on Jubilees of 49-year cycles that aligned with creation itself. And in this system, history was no longer floating. It was nailed down to specific years, specific days, and that rigidity exposed the pliability of other accounts, making it impossible to teach that certain events occurred when the numbers no longer aligned, making it impossible to preserve the theological gaps that allowed for invention. And so Jubilees became not a book but a threat, because it told us exactly when Adam was created, when he sinned, when he left the garden, how long he lived, how long from him to Noah, from Noah to Abraham, from Abraham to Moses, mapping out time not as myth, but as measurement. And in doing so, it demanded that we treat sacred history not as allegory but as chronology, and that alone overturned centuries of theological comfort. For if the events of Scripture must match their dates, then the stories cannot be rearranged to support evolving doctrines. And this is precisely what Jubilees disallows. It disallows floating feasts, redefined Sabbaths, priestly reinterpretations of festival dates, and it insists that the law was always there, before Sinai, before Moses, embedded in creation and kept by the patriarchs, and that revelation was not innovation but restoration, which means all claims of covenantal newness collapse, and that is a dangerous idea in a religious world that often survives on the illusion of spiritual progress, of unfolding truth, of laws that evolve into grace. But Jubilees freezes that evolution by showing that the righteous from the beginning already walked in divine order, and so it undermines the need for theological resets, and calls for return instead of reinvention. And this undermining is not theoretical, it's historical, because it challenges the way time itself was shaped by those in power, who adjusted the calendar to fit empires, to shift Sabbaths, to align feasts with Roman festivals, to move resurrection narratives to fit Sunday exaltation. And once time became flexible, theology followed, and doctrine adapted to a rhythm that no longer came from heaven, but from councils. And Jubilees exposes that shift mercilessly, declaring that the moment humanity began to follow lunar calendars instead of the fixed solar year, the festivals became corrupt, worship became misaligned, and covenantal faithfulness began to slip not because people stopped believing, but because they stopped remembering the appointed times. And if this is true, then the modern religious calendar, whether Jewish or Christian, is misaligned. And the true rhythm of heaven is only preserved where time remains fixed to creation. And this brings us to the heart of why Jubilees was feared. Because it does not allow for theological convenience, it does not bend to empire, and it treats the calendar as sacred text, which is something no other book dares to do. And in this reverence for time, it echoes a truth that Islam later re-establishes, that time is not neutral, that every act of obedience must happen within its appointed hour, and that divine law is inseparable from divine rhythm. And so when the Quran speaks of sacred months, of prayers at specific hours, of fasting in a named month, of pilgrimage in a named season, it is not innovating but reviving, returning to the timeline Jubilees recorded but which the world rejected. And this alignment makes Islam the living rhythm of a book it never canonized but fully embodies. Because the prayer times are fixed by the sun, the fast is tied to the moon, the pilgrimage fixed in the 12th lunar month, the days of slaughter appointed, the standing at Arafat immovable, and in that structure, the Ummah becomes a calendar-keeping community, doing what Jubilees once demanded, returning to the appointed times, rejecting man-made adjustments, and worshipping not only in word but in synchronized deed. And this is where the fear lies, because if the Book of Jubilees is true, then the systems that replaced its calendar are false. And if Islam restored what the church and the temple corrupted, then the claim to unbroken covenant becomes invalid. And the exclusive claims of doctrinal successors begin to tremble, for the true successor to Abraham is not the one who claims his name, but the one who walks his schedule. And if Jubilees was banned to protect theological restructuring, and if Islam came to realign what was broken, then the return of Jubilees is not an archaeological event. It's an existential crisis for every system that relies on temporal drift. And so the fear was never about apocryphal error. It was about chronological precision, because Jubilees brings with it a reckoning, a demand that our theology match our time, and our worship match our calendar. And when we fail that demand, our rituals become noise, our feasts become echoes, and our sacrifices arrive too late. And so the Book of Jubilees was not hidden because it lied, but because it remembered too clearly, and in doing so it reminded the world that God is not served by sincerity alone, but by synchronicity. That his covenant is not just about love but about law, and not just about law but about when that law is lived. And this is what Islam re-established, not a new faith but a right-timed one, a return to the coordinates of creation. And in that return, the banned book found a home again, not in the canon of men, but in the calendar of the faithful. So we must now ask, if Jubilees broke the timeline of the Bible, then who repaired it? If it was banned because it held the clock too steady, then what does it mean that Islam now moves to that same steady beat? And if remembering the time is equal to remembering the truth, then who truly remembers now? The fear of the Book of Jubilees was never rooted in heresy but in harmony, for a text that claims divine revelation and then dares to timestamp the sacred, to place every act of obedience, every sin, every birth, every death, every offering and every vision onto a fixed calendar, becomes a mirror that exposes the looseness of the narratives we have accepted. And it does so not by challenging the existence of prophets or the sanctity of revelation, but by insisting that sacred history follows sacred structure. And this is what makes it terrifying to institutions built on theological drift. It tells us not only what happened, but when it happened, and therefore what could not have happened. And this rigidity becomes unbearable to those who built doctrines on elastic time, on metaphors stretched over centuries, on reinterpretations that required forgetting the original rhythm of divine law, and in that forgetting, they thought they had freedom. But what Jubilees proves is that freedom without framework becomes faith without foundation, and it reveals that the shifting of calendars was never innocent, but deliberate, a slow dismantling of divine order to make room for political theology. And this is why it was buried, because it does not allow for Passover to be disconnected from its week, for Sabbaths to float, for the Feast of Weeks to be merged with Greco-Roman agriculture or Easter to be celebrated without regard for the day it was ordained. And it demands that righteousness be timed as well as sincere, that worship be scheduled as well as spiritual. And in this, it rewrites the qualifications of obedience from passion to precision and calls back a form of faith where time itself was part of covenant, where remembering the day was as important as the deed, and when read honestly. It makes clear that the distortion of God's calendar was not a minor error but a rebellion, one that crept in as Babylon conquered, as Greek philosophies spread, as Rome demanded uniformity, and councils met not to recover revelation, but to control it, to standardize narratives that could be adapted to empire. And in that process, the true order of days was traded for one that served power, and so the festivals were shifted, Sabbaths manipulated, equinoxes hidden, and theological concepts divorced from the appointed times that once made them alive. And it was the book of Jubilees that kept that record, that held the memory no one else wanted to remember, that traced the rebellion not in idolatry alone, but in calendars, showing that sin was also forgetting the schedule, that righteousness was knowing the week, and that every prophet who pleased God did so not just by belief, but by being on time. And this view echoes not in the canon, but in Islam, where obedience is not floating but fixed, where the 5 prayers are bound to the sun, the fast to the moon, the pilgrimage to the 12th lunar month. And this structure is not cultural, it is divine choreography, the restoration of what Jubilees recorded but the canon refused to carry. And this is why Islam, without citing the book, lives its truth, becoming the only global faith that continues to operate on a sacred calendar that is both lunar and synchronously tied to divine rhythm. Not man-made adjustment, and this is no coincidence, because the Quran repeatedly emphasizes appointed times, sacred months, scheduled prayers, acts of worship done not when convenient but when decreed, and in doing so it confirms the urgency Jubilees tried to preserve, that the age of man, the history of nations, the rise and fall of peoples are not random, but measured, structured in Jubilees of 49 years, in weeks of years, in divine appointments that echo across generations. And this timeline once revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai was not new, but ancient, older than law, older than Israel, reaching back to creation, to Adam, to the angels, and it was forgotten not through ignorance, but through erasure, buried in scrolls while doctrines were fashioned to suit empires. And the calendar that once governed all creation was replaced with one that governed only the church or only the synagogue, depending on which council won. And Jubilees tells us that this forgetting was not minor. It was catastrophic, for when time is broken, worship breaks with it, and when sacred rhythm is lost, sacred memory fades, and a people without rhythm becomes a people who sing without song, pray without pause, sacrifice without sequence, and eventually believe without boundary. And this breakdown is what Islam repaired, not through theological polemic, but through prophetic practice, restoring the calendar through lived action, through pilgrimage that cannot be moved, through fasting that begins not with hunger, but with the sighting of a crescent, through daily prayers whose times shift with the sun, forcing the believer to realign with heaven multiple times each day. And in this rhythm we find the ghost of Jubilees resurrected, not quoted but embodied, not canonized but walked, a legacy preserved not in books but in bowing. And this is what makes the silence around Jubilees even more haunting, for if its structure was true, and if its timeline was holy, then those who discarded it must face the consequence of misaligned history. And the Church, in building theology on Sunday over Sabbath, on Easter over Passover, on floating feast days shaped by political necessity rather than prophetic appointment, finds its entire rhythm questioned. And Judaism, in abandoning the solar calendar of the patriarchs for the Babylonian-influenced lunar one, finds its Sabbaths drifting, its years shortened, its feasts realigned. And both must reckon with the possibility that the covenant was never meant to change with culture, that the rhythm of heaven is not negotiable, and that obedience delayed is disobedience dressed in ritual. And so the Book of Jubilees was not only feared for its precision, it was feared for its implications, because once you believe its timeline, you must question your own, and once you accept its structure, you must ask whether your own rituals match the divine appointment. And once you realize that Islam follows the beat that Jubilees describes, you are forced to confront whether the faith that preserved the calendar might also have preserved the covenant. And this is the real fear, not that Jubilees is wrong, but that it is right, and that its exile was an act of suppression, and that the faith which never included it in its canon somehow lives it better than those who did. And so the question that rises from the dust of Qumran, from the buried fragments of a timeline once honored, is not merely what was lost, but who found it again, and if Islam now stands as the keeper of appointed times, of unbroken worship, of celestial alignment, then what does that say about who truly walks with the rhythm of heaven? What if the Book of Jubilees was not feared because it broke the timeline, but because it proved that someone else had preserved it? When a book is banned, it is often because it contains errors too dangerous to teach, but when a book is buried, it is usually because it contains truths too dangerous to confront, and the Book of Jubilees was not banned because it corrupted the sacred. It was buried because it clarified it, because it told the story of mankind with too much detail, offered the movements of prophets with too much precision, and demanded that every believer not only accept the will of God, but walk in his timing, aligning every fast, every feast, every offering, and every prayer with the original rhythm of creation. And this demand made it incompatible with a religious world that had long since learned to adapt holiness to empire, to bend devotion to politics, to reshape worship around cultural comfort. And Jubilees did not permit such shaping. It recorded time as holy law, not suggestion. And in doing so, it exposed the quiet heresy of substitution not in theology, but in scheduling, revealing that the greatest drift of mankind was not rebellion but retiming, not idolatry but calendar tampering, a reshaping of sacred days so subtle it became systemic. And this tampering became the backbone of religious reinvention, where empires rose and claimed to serve the God of Abraham while celebrating his commandments on days he never sanctified, holding feasts he never appointed, and calling sacred what the heavens had never confirmed. And it is precisely here where the Book of Jubilees delivers its most profound threat, not in theology but in chronology, because if the events of Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus are placed within the grid of exact time, then we are forced to ask hard questions about whether our own calendars still speak the language of God, and when we find they do not, we must then ask what authority gave us permission to change them, and that question cuts deeper than any doctrinal debate, for it challenges the very structure of our religion, and Jubilees pushes that challenge to its conclusion by stating plainly that the law was not new at Sinai but eternal, written before creation, observed by angels, followed by Enoch and Noah and Abraham, passed down through the righteous not by lineage alone, but by obedience to a calendar that God himself inscribed. And that calendar was solar, not lunar, was fixed, not floating, and when it was forgotten, the very heart of covenant faithfulness fractured, and religion became a beautiful echo of misaligned memory. But still, the echo carried traces of the original beat, and in some distant future, the beat would be remembered again, not through canon but through command, not through scribal ink but through surrendered limbs, and that remembering came in a place far from the councils of Rome or the hills of Jerusalem. It came through a man in a cave, in the deserts of Arabia, through verses that once again declared sacred months, appointed days, fixed times for prayer and worship and pilgrimage. And when Islam was born, it did not cite the Book of Jubilees, but it began to live it, aligning worship with the sun and the moon, commanding remembrance of appointed seasons, forbidding innovation in the schedule of obedience, and establishing a global ummah whose spiritual life revolved not around convenience but cadence. And in doing so, it accidentally or divinely revived the one book the world had tried hardest to forget, the one scroll that had dared to map time as untouchable. And though Muslims had never heard of Jubilees, they became its living heirs, not through quotation, but through synchronization, and their calls to prayer, their moon sightings, their fasting at dawn and breaking at sunset, their journeys to the Kaaba in the final lunar month, all of it testified that time had not been lost, only hidden. And now it had returned through a people who bowed not just in body but in hour, and this was the greatest fear of all. For if a faith could walk in the divine rhythm without ever reading the book that recorded it, then perhaps the spirit of that book had survived not through canon but through conduct, not through priesthood but through prophecy. And if that is true, then Islam becomes not the challenger of earlier revelations but their correction, not their destroyer but their reset, and the Book of Jubilees. Once exiled for speaking too plainly, finds its vindication not in synagogue or church but in masjid, where the rhythm it protected is practiced daily, hourly, annually, and this reality shakes the foundations of every tradition that forgot the calendar of the prophets. For it forces the honest believer to ask, if the Book of Jubilees was true in its structure, and Islam now walks that structure, then who truly honors the original covenant, those who changed the days, or those who remembered them? And if time was the test all along, not just faith but timing, not just belief but when that belief is lived, then what does it mean that Islam, without possessing the book, remembered the clock? That a faith accused of innovation might actually be the most ancient in function? And if all this is true, then the final question is not who holds the book, but who keeps its beat. What if the fear of Jubilees was never about doctrine, but about exposure? Exposure of who truly walks with the rhythm of heaven and who merely sings about it off-beat? What if God's greatest measure of obedience was not how loudly we proclaim His name, but how carefully we follow His time?